I am Hannah, 30 years old, and a forensic accountant working in the heart of Chicago. My days are spent tracking hidden assets and exposing financial lies, but nothing prepared me for the ultimate fraud living within my own family. My father stood on the porch of our family cabin, snatched a $200 bottle of wine from my hands, and told me they only invited me out of pity. He told me to sleep in the basement and to leave before I ruined their mood. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply smiled, poured myself a glass of ice water, and quietly drove back to the city. 4 days later, my family discovered that the cabin they were throwing me out of had just been sold by its legal owner, me. The locks were changed, their bank accounts were frozen by federal mandate, and a very serious lawyer letter arrived at their doorstep. They panicked, but they had absolutely no idea what else I had uncovered. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic relatives who thought they could walk all over you. The drive from Chicago to the Michigan lakefront is usually a peaceful escape. The highway cuts through dense forests before opening up to the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. For most people, arriving at a sprawling custom-built cedar and stone cabin right on the water is the highlight of their summer. For me, navigating the winding gravel driveway felt like bracing for a tactical negotiation. The property was stunning. Towering pine trees framed a 3-story architectural marvel with wraparound glass windows that reflected the afternoon sun. A massive wooden deck stretched out toward a private dock where a sleek speedboat gently bobbed in the water. From the outside, it was the absolute picture of upper-middle-class American success. But as a forensic accountant, I am trained to see past the polished exterior and look straight at the foundation. And the foundation of my family was entirely rotten. I parked my sensible sedan next to a gleaming black Porsche Cayenne that clearly belonged to my sister Ashley and her husband Devin. The contrast between my vehicle and theirs was comical, but it was a perfect representation of our different lives. I preferred quiet security. They preferred loud, aggressive consumption. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes, the only sound breaking the serene lakeside quiet. I took a deep breath of the crisp air, trying to shake off the anxiety that always accompanied family gatherings. I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out my peace offering. It was a vintage Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley, a bottle that cost more than I typically spend on groceries for a week. I had chosen it specifically because my father Donovan fancied himself a high society wine connoisseur. I thought it might buy me at least a few hours of basic civility. As I walked up the wide stone steps toward the heavy oak front door, I mentally rehearsed my greetings. I practiced the neutral, pleasant smile I used during tense corporate audits. Before I could even raise my hand to knock, the heavy wooden door swung open. My father stood in the threshold. At 60 years old, Donovan still carried himself like a man who owned the entire world. He was dressed in crisp linen trousers and a pristine polo shirt, his silver hair perfectly styled. He had the kind of arrogant posture that immediately demanded submission from everyone around him. There was no warm smile of greeting. There was no fatherly embrace. His eyes swept over me, taking in my plain dark jeans and simple blouse, his expression hardening into immediate, palpable disapproval. He did not say hello. Instead, his hand shot out and grabbed the neck of the wine bottle I was holding. He snatched it from my grip with enough force that I almost stumbled forward on the steps. He inspected the label, gave a tiny dismissive grunt, and then finally looked me in the eyes. I opened my mouth to speak, hoping to just get through the threshold, but he cut me off before a single syllable could escape my lips. "We are only inviting you out of pity," he said, his voice low and sharp like broken glass. "Do not get any ideas about making yourself comfortable this weekend." I froze, the words hitting me like a physical strike to the chest. I stared at him, trying to process the sheer malice in his tone. I had expected a cold reception, but this level of blatant cruelty took my breath away. "The guest rooms are full," he continued, completely unfazed by my shock. "Ashley and Devin need the space. Devin requires a home office setup for his startup work. You can take the air mattress down in the unfinished basement." And do us all a favor, do not stay long enough to ruin the mood this weekend. We have important people coming over later, and we do not need your depressing energy dragging the celebration down. For a fraction of a second, the old, desperate version of myself wanted to cry. The daughter who had spent 30 years trying to win the approval of a man who viewed her as a defective product, wanted to apologize, to shrink to beg for a real room. But I am not that girl anymore. I am 30 years old. I spend my days dismantling complex financial frauds and stripping lying executives of their false bravado. I deal with hard, unforgiving facts. And the fact staring me in the face right now was that this man did not love me. He did not respect me. He viewed my presence as a charitable act. He was being forced to endure an annoyance that threatened his perfect weekend aesthetic. I looked at the man who was supposed to be my protector. I looked at the luxurious house behind him, a house filled with expensive furniture, sweeping lake views, and a family that treated me like an infectious disease. The sheer audacity of his arrogance almost made me laugh. He was standing in a doorway, acting like a king defending his castle, completely blind to the reality of the ground beneath his feet. He had no idea who he was actually speaking to. He had no idea the kind of power I silently held over this entire charade. I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I simply looked at him, feeling a sudden icy calm wash over my entire body. The hurt evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp, calculating clarity. I maintained direct eye contact, refusing to look away or bow my head. I let the silence stretch between us, letting the weight of his cruel words hang in the heavy summer air. I watched his jaw tighten, clearly confused by my lack of an emotional breakdown. He expected tears. He expected an argument. He expected me to submit. Instead, I just gave him a slow, perfectly neutral smile. Before my father could react, the heavy wooden screen door swung open. A booming voice shattered the quiet afternoon air. I told them 50 million or we walk. You do not lowball a disruptive market leader. Tell the venture capital guys we have 3 term sheets ready to sign. Devin stepped onto the cedar porch, ignoring my presence. At 34 years old, my brother-in-law carried himself with the manic energy of a man desperate to prove he owned the universe. A strikingly handsome African-American man, his natural charisma was buried under an avalanche of luxury brands. He looked less like a tech chief executive officer and more like a walking billboard. He wore a silk Versace button-down shirt, unfastened halfway down his chest. A massive diamond-encrusted Audemars Piguet watch caught the sunlight on his left wrist. His feet were shoved into pristine white Balenciaga sneakers that had clearly never touched actual dirt. He paced across the deck, holding his smartphone an inch from his face on speaker mode, ensuring everyone could hear his supposed business triumph. Yeah, exactly, Devin barked. The valuation is solid. We close the funding round by Tuesday, or I take the intellectual property to a rival buyer. I am not playing games with amateur investors. To a layman, he sounded like a titan of industry. To a trained forensic accountant, he sounded like an amateur performing a memorized script. The buzzwords were hollow. The numbers were too conveniently massive. Real venture capital negotiations do not happen on speakerphone on a wooden deck. Right behind him, gliding through the doorway, came my older sister, Ashley. At 32, she was the undisputed golden child of the family. She was dressed in a pristine white linen sundress accessorized with an oversized Hermes tote bag and dark Celine sunglasses. She radiated an aura of unearned superiority. Ashley walked over to Devin, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. She kissed his cheek, playing the adoring, supportive wife to the wildly successful tech visionary. Devin ended his call with a dramatic sigh, slipping the device into his pocket. We got them, Devin announced to my father, his chest puffed out with pride. Series C funding is locked in. We are looking at a 9-figure valuation by Q4. My father's demeanor transformed instantly. The venomous glare he had directed at me vanished, replaced by absolute worship. Donovan vibrated with excitement, clapping his hands together and beaming at his son-in-law. Brilliant work, Devin. I always knew that startup of yours would revolutionize the industry. We need to open the vintage champagne tonight. It was only then that Ashley turned her gaze toward me, still standing at the bottom of the porch steps. She slowly lowered her sunglasses, her eyes dragging up and down my sensible dark jeans, my plain navy blouse, and my practical leather loafers. The visual contrast was stark. She was draped in aggressive, flashy wealth, while I wore clothes designed for comfort during long hours analyzing balance sheets. Ashley let out a sharp, breathless laugh that carried zero genuine amusement. She leaned against the wooden railing, looking down at me as if I were a particularly unappealing insect. "Hannah," Ashley said, drawing my name out with a lazy drawl. "You actually showed up. I thought you would be chained to a desk somewhere drowning in spreadsheets. It must be exhausting counting other people's pennies for a living." Devin chuckled loudly, wrapping his arm tighter around Ashley's waist. He looked down at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Hey, someone has to do the boring math, right? Not everyone is built for the high-stakes innovation game. Speaking of which, Hannah, did you park your sedan around back? I am having some potential angel investors drop by later, and I need the driveway clear for their black cars. Optics are everything in my line of work." I stood my ground, my posture relaxed but alert. My mind went to work processing the scene with clinical precision. My family was putting on a masterclass in aggressive insecurity. People with actual generational wealth do not behave this way. They do not scream their valuations into cell phones on a porch. They do not desperately mock a sibling's practical career to elevate their own status. The sheer arrogance radiating from Ashley and Devin was suffocating, but beneath that, I smelled an overwhelming stench of desperation. The oversized watch, the frantic name-dropping of angel investors, my father's desperate fawning over a man who spoke exclusively in empty corporate jargon. It was a house of cards. They were projecting an illusion of limitless wealth, yet my father had just spent the last 2 minutes aggressively humiliating me while ensuring I knew I was only allowed to sleep in an unfinished basement. If Devin was truly on the verge of a 9-figure valuation, why did Donovan look so incredibly tense underneath his forced smile? Why did Ashley grip the railing with knuckles turning white? The math simply did not add up, and I have never met an equation I could not solve. "Optics," I repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. "Yes, optics are very important." Ashley rolled her eyes, pushing off the railing and turning back to her husband. "Do not mind her, Devin. She just does not understand how the real world operates. Come on, Dad, let us go inside and prep the grill. The caterers are bringing the Wagyu beef any minute now, and we do not want to be standing out here when the real guests arrive." My father nodded eagerly, ready to follow his golden daughter and his supposedly billionaire son-in-law back into the house. He turned to me one last time, his eyes hard. "You heard your sister. Park around the back. The basement door is unlocked. Let yourself in, just stay out of the way, and do not touch the catering." I did not argue. I did not park my car around the back. I simply walked past my father, brushing past Ashley and Devin without making physical contact, and stepped into the sprawling entryway of the cabin. The interior was a testament to curated excess. Soaring vaulted ceilings displayed exposed timber beams. A massive stone fireplace dominated the living room, surrounded by plush leather sofas and carefully placed rustic artifacts that probably cost a small fortune. The air conditioning was cranked down to a freezing temperature, a sharp contrast to the humid summer heat outside. I ignored it all and headed straight for the open-concept kitchen. The granite countertops were already prepped for the caterers, gleaming under the recessed lighting. I set the vintage Cabernet Sauvignon down right in the center of the massive kitchen island. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. I walked over to the oversized smart refrigerator, pulled a crystal glass from the open shelving, and pressed the dispenser lever. The ice clattered into the glass, followed by the rush of filtered water. I took a single deliberate sip. The cold liquid slid down my throat, grounding me. I set the glass down next to the wine bottle. A perfect ring of condensation began to form on the polished stone. Then, without a single backward glance, I turned around and walked out the front door. My father was still standing on the porch, his arms crossed, waiting to make sure I followed his demeaning instructions. Ashley and Devin had already retreated toward the back deck, their loud laughter echoing across the property. Donovan opened his mouth, likely to issue another command, but I did not give him the chance. I walked straight down the stone steps past his judgmental glare and went directly to my sensible sedan. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and put the car in reverse. Donovan threw his hands up in a gesture of exaggerated frustration, shouting something I could not hear through the rolled-up windows. I smoothly backed out of the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires, and shifted into drive. I drove away from the lake, away from the toxic charade, and pointed my car toward the highway leading back to Chicago. The drive was a stark transition from the dense pine-scented woods of Michigan to the sprawling concrete arteries of the Midwest. For the first 20 miles, the silence in my car was absolute. I did not turn on the radio. I did not listen to a podcast. I just let the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt center my thoughts. Forensic accounting is a discipline built on patience. You do not react to the emotional distractions. You follow the money. You follow the paper trail. You wait for the exact right moment to present the undeniable truth. My family believed they held all the power because they controlled the social narrative. They believed their designer clothes and speakerphone negotiations made them untouchable. But I controlled the facts. As I merged onto Interstate 94, the city's skyline eventually coming into view on the horizon, I tapped the steering wheel button to activate my Bluetooth system. The digital display on my dashboard lit up as I scrolled through my contacts. I selected the name Marcus Vance. Marcus was one of the most ruthless and efficient luxury real estate brokers in the greater Chicago and tri-state area. He handled quiet, high-net-worth transactions for clients who valued absolute discretion. The line rang twice before he picked up. "Good afternoon, Hannah," Marcus said, his voice crisp and professional through the car speakers. "I was not expecting to hear from you today. I thought you were spending the weekend up at the lake property." "There has been a slight change of plans, Marcus," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I need you to initiate a transaction." "I am listening. I need you to pull the file on Lakeside Holdings LLC," I instructed. I heard the faint sound of a keyboard clicking in the background. Lakeside Holdings. Ah, yes. The Michigan property. Beautiful estate. What exactly are we doing with it? My father Donovan had spent the last 5 years strutting around that cabin, hosting lavish parties, and treating the property as his personal kingdom. He loved to casually mention his lake house to his country club associates. He loved the status it projected. What he conveniently forgot, or perhaps willfully chose to ignore, was the reality of how he had kept that house. 5 years ago, Donovan had over-leveraged himself on a series of disastrous commercial real estate ventures. He was days away from total bankruptcy. The bank was preparing to foreclose on the cabin to satisfy his outstanding debts. He was desperate, terrified of the public humiliation that would accompany a foreclosure. He had come to me begging for a loan. I knew giving him cash directly was the equivalent of setting it on fire. Instead, I used my own capital money I had quietly accumulated through successful corporate fraud recoveries and smart investments to purchase the bad debt directly from the bank. I formed Lakeside Holdings LLC, masking my identity behind layers of corporate registration, and bought the deed to the property outright. I saved him from bankruptcy, completely protecting his public image. I allowed him to continue using the cabin, paying a nominal lease fee directly to the LLC, letting him pretend he still owned it. It was a silent arrangement, a safety net I provided out of familial obligation. But pity, as my father had so eloquently stated today, has a strict expiration date. "Execute the sale immediately," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I want the property listed by the end of the business day." Marcus paused for a fraction of a second. "Are you certain the summer market is peaking right now? We could stage it, do a massive marketing push, and probably get 20% above market value if we wait a few weeks." "I am completely certain," I replied, gripping the steering wheel. "I do not want to wait. I do not want a marketing push. Sell it to a corporate conglomerate or an investment firm. I want a cash buyer only, and I want the closing process expedited. 10-day close maximum." "Understood," Marcus said, his tone shifting into full execution mode. I have 3 institutional buyers looking for premium waterfront rentals to add to their portfolios. They will pay cash and close in a week if the price is right. Consider it done. Should I notify the current occupants? No, I said smoothly. The new owners can handle the eviction process. Just get the paperwork filed. I ended the call. The digital display fading back to black. The highway stretched out before me, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. I felt no guilt. I felt no regret. I had simply done the math. My family had demanded I leave their property. I was just making sure it was actually theirs to demand. 4 days later, the morning sun bathed my corner office in a bright, unforgiving light. Sitting high above the busy streets of Chicago, I found comfort in the predictable rhythm of my morning routine. My workspace was a sanctuary of order and logic. 3 massive monitors dominated my sleek glass desk, displaying complex spreadsheets, banking trails, and corporate tax filings. As a forensic accountant, I lived in a world where numbers told the absolute truth. People could lie, fabricate their success, and project false wealth. But the math never deceived anyone. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, savoring the bitter roasted flavor while looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The chaotic weekend in Michigan felt like a distant memory, replaced entirely by the sterile efficiency of corporate finance. My cell phone rested on a wireless charging pad next to my keyboard. The screen suddenly lit up, accompanied by a sharp, distinct chime. It was an encrypted notification from my private wealth management bank. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. A wire transfer had just cleared. The numbers displayed in bold green text read $1,800,000 exactly. The transaction was flawless. Marcus, my real estate broker, had executed my exact commands with ruthless precision. He had bypassed the traditional housing market, entirely opting to sell the Michigan cabin directly to a massive corporate real estate conglomerate. They were an aggressive investment firm, known for buying up premium waterfront properties with cash and flipping them into luxury corporate retreats. They did not care about family history or sentimental value. They only cared about acquiring prime assets. The money was now sitting securely in my diversified portfolio, and the deed to Lakeside Holdings LLC was officially transferred. My financial safety net was completely liquidated, and I was permanently severed from my father's greatest source of pride. I set the phone down and took another sip of coffee, feeling a profound sense of closure. 200 miles away on the pristine shores of Lake Michigan, the morning was unfolding quite differently. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and fresh water, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the wooden dock. Donovan sat lounging on the expansive cedar deck of the cabin, utterly convinced of his own invincibility. He was stretched out on a plush outdoor sofa, wearing an expensive silk robe over his clothes, a freshly brewed espresso resting on the glass table beside him. For him, the weekend had been an absolute triumph. He believed he had successfully banished his disappointing daughter to the shadows, preserving the flawless aesthetic of his high society gathering. He had spent the last 4 days entertaining Devin and Ashley, drinking expensive liquor, and basking in the false glory of his son-in-law's supposed tech empire. Donovan leaned his head back against the cushions, closing his eyes, and letting the warm summer sun wash over his face. He felt like the undisputed master of his domain, a king surveying his private waterfront kingdom. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that the ground beneath his feet no longer belonged to him. The tranquility of the lakefront morning was suddenly violently shattered. A low mechanical rumble echoed through the dense forest surrounding the property. At first, Donovan dismissed it, assuming it was just a neighbor's landscaping crew or a large delivery truck out on the main highway. But the sound grew steadily louder, shifting from a distant hum to an aggressive, deafening roar. The ground beneath the cedar deck actually began to vibrate. Donovan opened his eyes, frowning in intense irritation. He sat up, gripping the armrests of his sofa, and peered out toward the front of the property. The heavy crunching of gravel and the grinding of massive metal tracks drowned out the peaceful sounds of the lake. Through the clearing of the pine trees, A massive yellow bulldozer rolled directly onto the manicured gravel driveway. The heavy machinery belched a thick plume of dark diesel exhaust into the pristine morning air, its massive metal blade hovering just inches above the ground. Donovan sprang to his feet, his face flushing with immediate rage. He marched toward the edge of the deck, fully prepared to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse on whatever incompetent construction crew had taken a wrong turn onto his private estate. He opened his mouth to shout, but the words caught in his throat as three sleek, unmarked black sport utility vehicles pulled up right behind the bulldozer. The vehicles parked aggressively across the front lawn, blocking the entire driveway and trapping Ashley and Devon's luxury cars near the garage. The doors of the sport utility vehicles opened in unison. 5 men stepped out onto the driveway. They were not wearing construction gear or landscaping uniforms. They were dressed in sharp, tailored business suits, carrying themselves with the cold, calculating authority of corporate enforcers. They looked entirely out of place in the rustic lakeside setting, projecting an aura of absolute legal dominance. The lead representative, a tall man with a severe haircut and rimless glasses, adjusted his suit jacket and walked purposefully up the stone steps toward the deck. He carried a thick leather portfolio under his arm and did not bother to offer a polite smile. Donovan stood frozen, his arrogant posture faltering for the very first time. He stared at the men, then at the massive bulldozer idling in his driveway, its engine rattling the windows of the cabin. The lead representative stopped at the top of the steps, looking Donovan directly in the eye. He reached into his leather portfolio and extracted a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. Without a word of friendly introduction or small talk, the man thrust the documents directly toward my father's chest. Donovan automatically reached out and took the papers, his hands trembling slightly as his eyes scanned the bold, legally binding text on the first page. It was an official notice of transfer and an immediate corporate eviction mandate. The representative spoke with a voice completely devoid of emotion or sympathy, informing Donovan that the property had been acquired by a real estate conglomerate in a closed cash sale. The new ownership required immediate vacant possession to begin slated demolition and commercial redevelopment. The paper in Donovan's hands was not a request or a negotiation. It was a finalized, undeniable legal eviction. The paper in Donovan's hands was not a polite request. It was an undeniable legal eviction. Donovan stood still and stared at the bold black ink. His brain simply refused to process the words. Eviction, conglomerate, vacant possession. These terms only applied to other people. They did not apply to Donovan. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking very old. He crushed the paper in his fist. He threw the crumpled ball at the lead representative. The man let the paper bounce off his lapel. "Get off my property!" Donovan roared, his voice echoing across the quiet lake. He pointed a trembling finger at the men in suits and then at the idling bulldozer. "I am calling the police and having every one of you arrested for trespassing." The representative produced a second copy of the eviction notice. "We strongly advise you to begin packing, sir," he stated in a monotone. "The demolition crew begins site clearing by mid-afternoon." Donovan ignored him completely. Snatching his cell phone from his pocket, he dialed 911. Pacing across the deck, he shouted into the receiver. He demanded immediate police presence, claiming a gang of corporate thugs had invaded his private estate with heavy machinery. He used his authoritative voice. The glass doors slid open, and Devon stepped onto the deck, followed closely by Ashley. Devon was wearing a designer tracksuit, holding his phone as if preparing to film. "What is going on here?" Devon demanded. "Who are these guys? Donovan?" Donovan held up a hand, silencing his son-in-law. "They are scam artists, Devon," he barked, slipping the phone away. "They showed up with a fake eviction notice claiming they bought the cabin. The police are on their way to clear them out." Ashley let out a scoff of disbelief. "Are you serious?" she asked, glaring at the suited men. "Do you have any idea who we are? My husband is closing a massive tech funding round this weekend, and my father owns this property. You are ruining our morning." The corporate representatives remained unmoved by Ashley's tirade. They stood in a loose semicircle on the driveway, a silent wall between the family and the exit. The bulldozer continued to idle its low rumble, serving as a constant reminder of the impending destruction. Within 10 minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the summer air. Two local police cruisers sped down the driveway, kicking up dust and sliding to a halt just behind the black sport utility vehicles. Their red and blue lights flashed against the trees. Four uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles, resting their hands cautiously on their duty belts. Donovan immediately marched down the wooden steps, projecting the aura of a relieved victim. "Officers, thank God you are here," he announced, gesturing broadly toward the corporate team. "These men have invaded my property with heavy machinery. They are trespassing and trying to execute an elaborate real estate scam. I want them removed from my land immediately, and I want to press full charges." The senior police officer, a man with graying hair and a deeply lined face, held up a hand to pause Donovan's frantic demands. The officer walked past my father and approached the lead corporate representative. The suited man did not speak. He simply opened his thick leather portfolio and extracted a highly organized stack of documents, handing them directly to the officer. Donovan crossed his arms, a smug, confident smile returning to his face. He looked at Devin and Ashley, giving them a reassuring nod. He was entirely convinced that the local authorities would swiftly eject the intruders, allowing his perfect weekend to resume without further interruption. He waited for the officer to turn around with handcuffs ready. Instead, the senior officer spent several long, agonizing minutes carefully reviewing the documents. He scrutinized the deed of sale, the transfer of ownership filings, the corporate registration, and the expedited eviction mandate. He flipped back and forth between the pages, comparing signatures and verifying the official county seals stamped on the corners. The smug smile on Donovan's face began to falter as the silence stretched on. The officer finally lowered the stack of papers and let out a heavy sigh. He turned slowly away from the corporate representative and walked back to where Donovan was standing. "Sir," the officer said, his tone shifting from neutral investigation to firm authority, "these documents are entirely legitimate." Donovan stepped back as if physically struck. "That is impossible," he shouted. "I legally own this house. I personally built this house." "You do not own this house, sir," the officer corrected, tapping the top sheet of paper. "According to the county registrar, this property has been owned for the past 5 years by an entity called Lakeside Holdings, LLC. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, Lakeside Holdings, LLC, executed a legal cash sale to this corporate conglomerate. They are the rightful legal owners of this estate." Donovan's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His mind raced frantically, trying to comprehend the impossible. Lakeside Holdings, LLC. He knew the name. He knew the arrangement. He had paid his nominal lease fee to that entity every month for 5 years to maintain the illusion of ownership. But the only person who controlled Lakeside Holdings, LLC, the only person who held the power to sell the property out from under him, was the daughter he had just banished to the basement. Hannah Donovan whispered the name, escaping his lips like a cursed breath. The officer nodded, looking down at the paperwork. "Yes, sir. That is the name of the sole proprietor listed on the sale execution. Hannah. She legally transferred the deed to these gentlemen, which means, sir, that you and your family are currently trespassing on private corporate property." Ashley let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching Devin's arm. Devin stared at the officer, his eyes wide with sudden panic. The reality of the situation crashed down upon them, completely shattering their carefully constructed facade of wealth and power. The senior officer took a step closer to Donovan, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. "The new owners have requested immediate vacant possession," the officer stated, his voice hard and uncompromising. "They have the legal right to bulldoze this structure today. You and your family have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. My officers and I will remain right here on site to supervise your departure and ensure you do not take anything that belongs to the property. Your 2 hours of time start exactly right now." The silence that followed the senior officer's declaration was absolute, heavy with the crushing weight of sudden, inescapable reality. Then the dam broke. Ashley shrieked a high, piercing sound that sent a flock of birds scattering from the nearby pine trees. "You cannot do this to us. The caterers are exactly 30 minutes away. They are bringing A5 Wagyu beef. We have a private sommelier setting up a vintage wine tasting station." She turned wildly to Devon, grabbing the lapels of his unbuttoned silk shirt. "Devon, do something. Your angel investors are driving up from Detroit right now. They are expecting a luxury corporate retreat, not a demolition site." Devon backed away from his wife, his meticulously crafted persona of a billionaire tech visionary, instantly dissolving into the frantic, rapid blinking of a cornered fraud. He held his hands up, stammering a string of incoherent excuses about calling his legal team, but he made absolutely no move to pull his smartphone from his pocket. The police officers stood unbothered by the dramatic theatrics, their arms crossed over their protective vests, watching the implosion with cold professional detachment. Donovan staggered backward, his shoulder bumping hard against the wooden railing of the deck. The healthy, vibrant color had completely drained from his face, replaced by a sickly grayish pallor that made him look instantly 10 years older. 2 hours. He repeated the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. The senior officer stepped forward, gesturing firmly toward the front door of the cabin. 1 hour and 58 minutes, sir. I highly suggest you start gathering your personal effects. The humiliation was absolute and comprehensive. My father, the man who thrived on projecting total superiority and aggressive control, was instantly reduced to a frantic, scrambling tenant. Ashley abandoned her verbal tirade, finally realizing the police were not bluffing, and bolted into the cabin to save her designer luggage and expensive cosmetics. Devon followed close behind, barking useless, panicked orders at the empty walls. The corporate representatives simply walked back to their black vehicles, leaning against the hoods to wait out the clock, while the bulldozer driver cut his engine and calmly lit a cigarette. 200 miles away, the atmosphere in my downtown Chicago office was one of clinical, pristine serenity. The central air conditioning hummed a low, steady note, filtering the ambient noise of the city below. I was deeply engrossed in reviewing a complex offshore tax structure for a corporate client when my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass surface of my desktop. The caller ID flashed my father's name in bright white letters. I let it vibrate for exactly 5 seconds, analyzing the timing. The police had undoubtedly delivered the eviction notice. The crushing reality of the sale had firmly set in. I picked up the device and pressed accept. I did not say hello. I simply held the phone to my ear, waiting for the inevitable explosion. "You ungrateful, deceitful, malicious snake!" Donovan screamed, his voice completely blowing out the microphone on his end of the line. The sheer volume forced me to physically hold the phone a few inches away from my face. "You stole my house. You humiliated me in front of the police. You ruined the weekend for Devon's investors. I am calling the district attorney. I am having you arrested and thrown in prison for grand larceny." I listened to the unhinged tirade with total, unwavering emotional detachment. Forensic accountants are extensively trained to find the crucial signal hidden within the chaotic noise. The noise was his furious rage. The signal was the specific, revealing vocabulary of his panic. "You have absolutely no legal standing, Donovan," I stated, keeping my voice flat, calm, and entirely conversational. "Lakeside Holdings LLC owned that property. I am the sole managing member of Lakeside Holdings. The bank records the transfer deeds, and the corporate filings are entirely airtight and legally binding. You were a month-to-month tenant, and your lease was officially terminated upon the execution of the sale." "That was my money," he bellowed, a raw, terrifying desperation cracking his voice. "That house was mine. You wire that $1.8 million into my primary checking account this exact second. Hannah, I swear to God, you wire the entire amount right now, or I will destroy your career. I need that capital. I need it today." I pressed the red button on the screen to end the call, cutting off his frantic screaming mid-sentence. I opened his contact profile, scrolled directly to the bottom of the menu, and tapped block caller. I set the phone face down on the polished glass desk, folding my hands in my lap. My hands were perfectly steady. My mind, however, was racing, connecting disparate data points with cold mathematical precision. Donovan's reaction was entirely wrong. It was wildly disproportionate to the situation at hand. Yes, losing a sprawling summer home and being publicly embarrassed in front of his golden daughter was a massive bruising blow to his fragile ego. But an injured ego does not cause a grown man to scream for a wire transfer with that level of raw, unadulterated terror. He did not sound like an arrogant man who had simply lost a luxury vacation spot. He sounded exactly like a man who had just watched his last remaining financial lifeboat burn to the ground. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers together. Why did my father urgently need almost $2 million in liquid capital by the end of the business day? He had proudly claimed Devon was closing a massive 9-figure funding round. If Devon's tech startup was truly that successful, a minor real estate hiccup would be nothing more than a temporary annoyance. It would be easily solved by Devon writing a quick check to rent a luxury hotel suite for his investors. Instead, Devon had panicked like a cornered rat, and Donovan was screaming for cash. It meant the tech empire was a complete and utter fabrication. It meant Devon had no investors, no funding, and absolutely no actual capital. Furthermore, it meant my father was completely dangerously financially exposed. If Donovan was relying on the lake house as a hidden asset, a secret reserve of stored value to leverage against a looming catastrophe, then his primary financial situation in Chicago was likely entirely compromised. He had been using the illusion of that house to project an image of solvency to creditors who were probably already circling his main businesses. The frantic demand for the money, the specific requirement that it be wired immediately spoke volumes. It reeked of margin calls, aggressive debt collectors, or perhaps a massive impending loan default. He was not just angry, he was financially drowning, and he had firmly tied himself to a son-in-law who was equally broke, both men sinking in a sea of luxury brands and empty corporate jargon. They had carefully orchestrated a fragile illusion of immense wealth built entirely on leveraged debt, smoke, and lies. By selling the cabin to a corporate conglomerate, I had not just evicted them from a weekend retreat. I had inadvertently pulled the single structural pin holding their entire fraudulent house of cards together. I turned back to my array of glowing monitors, closing the offshore tax file and opening a fresh encrypted spreadsheet. It was time to initiate a full covert forensic audit of Donovan's primary corporate holdings. If he was desperate enough to beg me for a massive wire transfer while standing in front of armed police officers, the paper trail he left behind in the city was going to be an absolute disaster. The math was about to get incredibly interesting. I locked down my workstation at the corporate firm precisely at 6 in the evening. The offshore tax file was sealed, and the encrypted spreadsheet I had initiated was transferred directly to my secure personal server. Corporate espionage and familial fraud required an entirely different environment than a glass-walled skyscraper. I rode the elevator down to the subterranean parking garage, navigated the dense evening Chicago traffic, and arrived at my loft in the West Loop. My home office was a dedicated fortress of data processing. 4 ultra-high-definition monitors were mounted in a curved, seamless array across a heavy oak desk. The server rack humming quietly in the corner was custom-built for handling massive data scraping operations and running complex financial modeling software. I dropped my keys on the granite kitchen counter, brewed a double shot of dark espresso, and walked into the office. I closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the ambient noise of the city. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair, waking the system with a tap of the keyboard. The screens flared to life, illuminating the darkened room with a cool blue light. It was time to go hunting. Forensic accounting is not about hacking into secure mainframes or breaking passwords. It is about knowing exactly where public records are buried, understanding the bureaucratic architecture of corporate registration, and knowing how to legally extract the hidden truth. People leave digital fingerprints everywhere. I started with the most obvious target. I typed Devon's full legal name into a specialized subscription-based database that aggregates state-level corporate registrations, tax liens, and civil court dockets. Devon claimed to be the chief executive officer of a disruptive market leader on the absolute verge of a massive Series C funding round. Legitimate technology startups leave massive undeniable footprints. They have registered patents, verifiable angel investors filed Securities and Exchange Commission forms, and transparent corporate boards. Devon had absolutely none of these things. The search query returned a cluster of empty limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming. They were classic shell corporations designed to mask ownership and obscure a complete lack of operational activity. I pulled the annual franchise tax reports for his primary entity. The gross revenue listed was exactly 0. The employee headcount was listed as 1. There was no venture capital. There were no angel investors. Devon's entire tech empire was nothing more than a registered web domain and a rented virtual office address in a shared downtown co-working space. I dug deeper, accessing public civil court records across Illinois and Michigan. The results painted a pathetic, grim picture of a man living entirely on credit. Devon was drowning in toxic personal debt. He had multiple default judgments against him for unpaid luxury car leases and maxed-out credit cards. He owed tens of thousands of dollars to high-end jewelers, boutique tailors, and exclusive dining clubs. The diamond-encrusted watch and the pristine designer sneakers he flaunted were financed on aggressive high-interest lines of credit. He was a walking mirage, burning through borrowed cash to project an aura of immense wealth he did not actually possess. But Devon's pathetic grift did not fully explain Donovan's absolute unhinged terror on the phone earlier. My father was a seasoned, albeit reckless, commercial real estate developer. He would not panic over his son-in-law's unpaid credit card bills. There had to be a larger, significantly more destructive connection between the two men. I cleared the side screens and pivoted my search parameters, typing in my parents' primary residential address and the corporate identification numbers for Donovan's main holding companies. I pulled the county property tax records for the sprawling colonial house my parents occupied in the affluent suburbs. The initial search revealed 2 distinct aggressive refinancing actions taken within the last 18 months. Donovan had extracted nearly every single cent of equity from his primary residence. I moved to the commercial sector, utilizing a specialized financial terminal to access the lien records on his remaining business properties. The screen instantly flooded with red flags. Donovan's commercial real estate portfolio was in catastrophic distress. His retail occupancy rates had plummeted, and his commercial mortgages were severely underwater. The public county records showed that he was dangerously delinquent on property taxes across 3 different commercial locations. The regional banks had already filed preliminary notices of default. My father was hemorrhaging capital on a daily basis, desperately trying to keep his failing commercial empire afloat by moving money from one sinking ship to another. I opened a digital link analysis software on my center monitor to map out the network. I dragged the data node representing Devon's fake tech startup onto the screen and then dragged the node representing Donovan's failing commercial enterprise right next to it. I instructed the software to run a comprehensive sweep, searching for any financial crossover, any shared registered agents, or joint legal filings. For a moment, a loading icon spun in the center of the display. Then a thick red line snapped into existence, directly connecting Donovan to Devon. I clicked on the connecting link, expanding the underlying public document. It was a publicly recorded Uniform Commercial Code financing statement. The details printed on the screen were staggering. 9 months ago, Donovan had taken out a massive high-yield mezzanine loan from a private, unregulated lending syndicate. The interest rate was extortionate, designed specifically for desperate borrowers who had been permanently blacklisted by traditional banking institutions. He had used his entire remaining portfolio of commercial assets as collateral. I traced the destination of those borrowed funds. Donovan had not injected that capital back into his dying real estate business to save his properties. He had wired the entire sum, over $2 million, directly into the primary operating account of Devon's Hollow Shell Corporation. Donovan had fully bought into his son-in-law's ridiculous charade. He believed Devon was actually building a billion-dollar tech giant. My father had bet his entire remaining financial existence on the delusion that Devon's startup would yield a massive return and save his crumbling empire. the entire picture locked into perfect, terrifying focus. Devon was likely promising Donovan that the impending imaginary funding round would allow him to repay the massive syndicate loan. But the funding round was a complete lie. The private lending syndicate was undoubtedly calling their note due. Donovan had planned to quietly sell the Michigan cabin himself, hoping to use that cash to stave off his aggressive, dangerous creditors until Devon's fictional payday arrived. By selling the cabin out from under him, I had instantly vaporized his last desperate contingency plan. I sat back in the glow of the monitors, the digital web of ruin illuminating my face. My father was not just facing simple bankruptcy. He was facing complete, irreversible financial annihilation. The math was flawless, and the math was absolutely merciless. I pushed my chair closer to the desk, the soft leather creaking in the quiet room. The overarching picture of my father's ruin was clear, but the anatomy of the poison that killed him required a deeper, more surgical extraction. I isolated the node representing Devon's primary corporate entity on my screen. I needed to understand exactly how a man who wore silk Versace shirts at noon had managed to evaporate $2 million of my father's mezzanine debt in less than 9 months. Forensic accounting is not magic. It is the relentless, methodical pursuit of anomalies. I executed a specialized deep web script designed to scrape the internet for any digital infrastructure tied to Devon's supposed tech firm. If you are building a disruptive market leader, you have developers. You have vast server hosting fees. You have software subscriptions, encrypted GitHub repositories, robust beta testing platforms, and heavily documented intellectual property filings. The script finished its sweep in under 4 minutes. The results were entirely blank. There was no proprietary software. There was no revolutionary product. There was not a single solitary line of code associated with Devon's name or his registered limited liability companies. The so-called tech startup was an absolute black hole. It was a masterful illusion constructed entirely out of corporate buzzwords and high-end catering. Devon was not a chief executive officer. He was a highly charismatic, predatory parasite. I accessed a secondary financial database, one that specifically tracks high-risk vendor payments and aggressive debt collection agencies. I began cross-referencing the exact dates of Donovan's $2 million wire transfer with Devon's personal expenditure footprint. The correlation was immediate and sickeningly precise. Within 48 hours of receiving my father's desperate leveraged capital, Devon had executed a flurry of massive outgoing wire transfers. He did not hire software engineers or secure commercial server space. He wired $400,000 directly to an automotive holding company to pay off the ballooning delinquent arrears on his fleet of leased exotic cars. He transferred another $600,000 to a private boutique credit consortium that specialized in financing ungodly expensive jewelry and designer wardrobes for clients who lacked actual liquidity. The remaining $1 million had been systematically diced into smaller, distinct payments over the next several weeks. I meticulously tracked those smaller wires through the banking network. They were not going to vendors or employees. They were going to individuals. Wealthy individuals scattered across the tri-state area. The names matched a list of people Devon had frequently tagged in his social media posts, proudly referring to them as his visionary angel investors. The pattern was blindingly obvious. It was a textbook, ruthlessly efficient, miniaturized Ponzi scheme. Devon was actively seducing wealthy, gullible individuals who desperately wanted the prestige of being ground-floor investors in the next big tech unicorn. He would take their initial seed money, funnel it directly into his personal checking accounts, and use it to wholly fund his absurdly lavish lifestyle. Ashley's pristine white linen sundresses, the massive diamond-encrusted Audemars Piguet, watches the catered Wagyu beef barbecues. It was all paid for by a revolving door of defrauded benefactors. When the older investors inevitably started demanding progress reports, beta versions of the software, or tangible returns on their capital, Devon simply went out and hunted a new victim. He used the fresh injection of cash from the new target to pay a fraction of a dividend back to the older investors. It was just enough capital to pacify them, silence their lawyers, and keep the grand illusion alive. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul all while wearing pristine white Balenciaga sneakers. And Donovan, blinded by his desperate need to associate with limitless success, had been the biggest, fattest mark of them all. My father had literally handed over the remnants of his entire commercial real estate empire to fund Ashley and Devin's weekend cosplay as billionaires. But the music was finally violently stopping. I ran a velocity analysis on Devin's primary operational accounts. The intake of new victim capital had severely dried up over the last 3 months. You can only fake success for so long before the complete lack of an actual tangible product makes the private market deeply suspicious. Devin's outgoing expenses, however, had not slowed down by a single fraction. The interest on his toxic personal loans was compounding daily. The staggering lease payments on his cars, the relentless maintenance on his fabricated lifestyle, the sheer crushing cost of keeping Ashley wrapped in Hermes. It was a bottomless furnace burning through cash he no longer possessed. He was completely, hopelessly broke. His mounting liabilities dwarfed his imaginary assets by an astronomical margin. He was leveraged far past the breaking point, teetering blindly on a jagged financial precipice with absolutely zero remaining safety net. There were no new term sheets ready to sign. There was no Series C funding roundabout to close by Tuesday. The screaming performance he put on for the wooden deck earlier that day, barking aggressively into his speakerphone, was a frantic, desperate piece of street theater designed solely to keep my father believing the lie for just a few more days. The sheer scale of the fraud was breathtaking in its audacity. Devin had successfully weaponized my family's profound, aggressive insecurity. He recognized instantly that my father and my sister cared significantly more about the appearance of wealth than the actual grueling labor of acquiring it. He sold them a glittering mirror reflecting their own shallow desires, and they bought it eagerly, blindly, signing away their entire future for the privilege of looking down on others. I stared at the final undeniable balance glowing at the bottom of the screen. Devin's net worth was heavily, devastatingly negative. He was functionally bankrupt, carrying millions in fraudulent, unserviceable debt, with absolutely no legal mechanism for repayment. The corporate eviction from the Michigan cabin was not merely a loss of a summer vacation home. It was the match that would instantly ignite the explosive destruction of their entire reality. The facade had shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but digital dust and a mountain of unpaid invoices. But as I stared at the terminal, a lingering anomaly gnawed at the edges of my focus. Devin's catastrophic failure was absolute, and Donovan's resulting panic made perfect sense. Yet the mechanics of that $2 million mezzanine loan defied basic financial logic. Private lending syndicates, even the predatory ones operating in the shadow banking sector, are entirely ruthless. They do not hand out seven-figure sums based on a firm handshake and a charming smile. They require pristine, undeniable collateral or an impeccable guarantor. Donovan possessed neither. His commercial portfolio was a radioactive wasteland of defaults, and his personal credit score had likely flatlined months ago. Brenda, my mother, was equally useless on paper, having never held a substantial income-producing asset in her own name. So how did they secure the cash to fund Devin's illusion? I shifted my attention back to the primary server, opening a secure portal to the county registrar's digital archives. I bypassed the standard summary screens and requested the raw digitized PDF of the original loan origination packet. The file was massive, containing hundreds of pages of dense legal boilerplate amortization schedules and liability waivers. I scrolled relentlessly past the primary borrower information, ignoring Donovan's bold, aggressive signatures. I was hunting for the guarantor addendum, the specific legal mechanism that had satisfied the syndicate's risk assessors. Page 47 loaded onto the center monitor. The screen illuminated a standard joint and several liability clauses. There were 3 signatures at the bottom of the page. The first was Donovan's. The second was Brenda's, her looping, elegant cursive standing out against the stark black and white document. The third signature stopped the breath in my lungs. It was a clumsy, slightly rushed forgery of my own name. Directly below the fraudulent signature line neatly typed in 12-point Arial font was a social security number. I recognized the 9 digits instantly. It was mine. The cold, analytical detachment that usually governed my professional life shattered, replaced by a sudden, sickening wave of vertigo. I cast my mind backward, sifting through the toxic memories of my adolescence. A joint checking account opened when I was 16 to deposit my wages from a summer job. Decades-old tax dependency filings meticulously stored in the locked mahogany filing cabinet in my father's home office. They had kept my identifying documents, preserving my pristine financial identity like a dormant weapon waiting for the exact moment they needed to deploy it. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a new frantic energy. I bypassed standard consumer monitoring applications and accessed a highly restricted institutional-level credit reporting terminal. I ran a comprehensive hard pull on my own social security number. The system processed the request, the progress bar inching forward for 3 agonizing seconds. When the screen finally refreshed, the resulting cascade of red text made the air in my home office feel terrifyingly thin. It was not just the $2 million syndicate loan. My parents had systematically and brutally weaponized my identity over the past 14 months. The screen displayed a horrifying network of unauthorized liabilities. There were multiple high-yield revolving credit lines, unsecured signature loans, and a secondary mortgage attached to a failing commercial property in Detroit that I had absolutely no legal connection to. They had drained the phantom equity of my perfect hard-earned credit score to keep Devon's Ponzi scheme from imploding. The ultimate betrayal crystallized before my eyes. They had literally sold my financial future to buy Ashley another season of country club memberships and bespoke wardrobe updates. Brenda, my own mother, had likely sat at her pristine dining room table, smiling her perfectly practiced suburban smile, while she meticulously practiced forging my signature onto fraudulent bank documents. Donovan had orchestrated the entire theft, willingly sacrificing his younger daughter's economic survival to appease the insatiable greed of his golden child and her parasitic husband. I clicked through the specific disbursements, the financing for the luxury vehicles Devon drove co-signed by me, the platinum tier credit cards Ashley used to purchase vintage wine, and A5 Wagyu beef guaranteed by my social security number. They had turned my life's work, my unblemished financial record, into a limitless, unregulated, automated teller machine. They had tethered me to a sinking, burning ship without my knowledge, fully intending to let me drown when the water finally rushed in. They assumed I would never find out until the creditors showed up at my door, by which time Devon and Ashley would presumably have secured real funding and covered the tracks. Or worse, they simply did not care if I went to prison for defaulting on massive loans I never authorized. The shock evaporated, leaving behind a searing white-hot fury. This was no longer a simple case of bad investments, bruised egos, or foolish pride. This was aggressive, calculated identity theft. This was a deliberate predatory felony committed by the 2 people who were biologically supposed to protect me. I immediately began running isolation protocols. I systematically locked down my compromised accounts, placing hard freezes on every credit bureau and generating severe fraud alert mandates. I pulled the digital metadata from the loan applications, isolating the IP addresses, the electronic timestamps, and the specific notary stamps that had processed these fraudulent documents. The notary seal on the syndicate loan belonged to an associate of my father's, a man named Arthur Vance, who had clearly looked the other way while Brenda signed my name. I added Arthur's details to the rapidly expanding encrypted spreadsheet of targets. I was not just a victim. I was a forensic accountant. I knew exactly how to dismantle this entire criminal enterprise piece by piece. I documented every single fraudulent transaction, creating an airtight, unassailable evidentiary trail that no defense attorney could ever hope to dismantle. The eviction at the lake house was merely an opening salvo, a minor inconvenience compared to the storm I was about to unleash. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, dragging me into their web of criminal liability. Federal prison was no longer just a theoretical possibility for my father, my mother, and my brother-in-law. Armed with this devastating chain of evidence, it was now an absolute mathematical certainty. I stared at the glowing certainty of their federal prison sentences, and a sudden chilling epiphany locked into place. The sudden invitation to the lake house. The bizarre out-of-character insistence from my mother that I join their weekend getaway. My family actively despised my presence, viewing my practical wardrobe, my demanding career, and my analytical mindset as a stain on their carefully curated aesthetic. Yet my mother had practically begged me to attend this specific retreat. I opened a secondary calendar application, cross-referencing the dates of the impending commercial loan defaults with the weekend itinerary. The timing was not a mere coincidence. It was a hard deadline. The private lending syndicate had undoubtedly demanded in-person verification for the next required tranche of capital. Or perhaps Devon had attempted to open a massive consolidated equity release line to buy them another 6 months of luxury, and the underwriters required a physical signature with photo identification to clear the final anti-fraud hurdles. They did not invite me to the cabin out of pity or a sudden desire for familial bonding. They needed my physical body on the premises. They were going to corner me, ply me with expensive wine, and emotionally manipulate me into signing a stack of complex legal documents disguised as an innocuous family trust update or a routine tax filing. My unexpected defiance on Friday night had ruined everything. By refusing to tolerate Ashley's insults, getting banished to the basement, and subsequently leaving the property entirely under the cover of darkness, I had unknowingly walked out of a meticulously laid trap. Devon's frantic, unhinged anger when I retreated downstairs was not just about his sister-in-law ruining the vibe of his party. It was the visceral, terrifying panic of a con artist watching his crucial mark walk out the door. Their entire fraudulent house of cards required my fresh signature by Monday morning to prevent total collapse. No wonder Donovan had completely lost his mind when the police showed up with the eviction notice. I had not just kicked them out of a luxury cabin, I had stolen their only remaining financial lifeline. The lingering shock hardened into cold, focused execution. I partitioned a dedicated, heavily encrypted drive on my server and named it simply with my father's primary corporate tax identification number. I began dragging the raw data into highly organized subfolders, building an impenetrable cage of evidence. First, I locked down the digital footprint. I extracted the IP logs from the fraudulent loan applications and the digital access records from the credit bureaus. The e-notary timestamps and digital signatures traced directly back to the static IP address of my parents' suburban home and the IP address registered to Devon's luxury penthouse apartment. They had not even bothered to use a virtual private network to mask their locations. They were arrogant, sloppy, and entirely technologically illiterate. Next, I built the financial flowcharts. I mapped the exact routing numbers, SWIFT codes, and transaction hashes, proving definitively that the loan capital secured by my stolen identity bypassed my personal accounts entirely. I linked the incoming syndicate funds directly to Devon's empty shell corporation. I then tracked those exact dollars flowing outward, matching the timestamps of the wire transfers to the exact dates Devon paid his exotic car leases and settled Ashley's accounts at high-end designer boutiques. I compiled the forged DocuSign certificates, extracting the underlying metadata that proved the documents were opened, signed, and submitted from devices I did not own, operating in locations I had not visited. I packaged the data with the ruthless precision of a seasoned prosecutor preparing for a grand jury. Every claim was supported by a direct link to a public record, a verifiable bank transaction, or a subpoena-ready digital log. I wrote a comprehensive 20-page executive summary detailing the exact mechanics of the fraud, the identities of the co-conspirators, the specific federal statutes violated, and the total dollar amount of the theft. It was a devastating, self-contained dossier. It left absolutely no room for alternative interpretations, plea deals, or claims of ignorance. It was a bulletproof roadmap to a multi-count federal indictment. Local law enforcement would be entirely unequipped to handle a financial crime of this magnitude and complexity. A local municipal detective might be swayed by Donovan's bluster, Devon's expensive suits, or my mother's practiced tears. This level of coordinated identity theft and wire fraud required the heavy, unyielding machinery of the federal government. I opened a secure, encrypted browser window and navigated to the official tip submission portal for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. I filled out the intake forms methodically outlining the wire fraud, the aggravated identity theft, and the criminal conspiracy. I attached the encrypted dossier, double-checking the file integrity hashes. But I was not finished. A con artist's worst nightmare is not just the FBI. It is the absolute uncompromising reach of the Internal Revenue Service. I opened a second secure window accessing the IRS Criminal Investigation Division's whistleblower portal. Devon had been shifting millions of dollars through shell companies to fund a lavish lifestyle without reporting a single cent of legitimate taxable income. My father had committed blatant tax fraud by leveraging underwater commercial assets through unregulated channels and hiding the proceeds. I uploaded the same comprehensive dossier to the IRS, specifically highlighting the massive tax evasion, the undeclared luxury assets, and the fraudulent corporate filings. I paused for a fraction of a second, my finger hovering over the mouse. This was the point of absolute no return. Once I clicked submit, there would be no turning back. There would be no family dinners, no awkward holiday gatherings, no chance of a quiet reconciliation. The federal government would descend upon them with terrifying, unstoppable force. Their assets would be frozen, their passports flagged, their reputations globally and permanently annihilated. I thought about the forged signature on the loan documents. I thought about the millions of dollars of toxic debt strapped to my name while Ashley paraded around in designer clothes bought with my stolen future. I clicked submit on the FBI portal and then immediately clicked submit on the IRS portal. The screen refreshed, displaying a sterile automated confirmation message. The trap was set, but this time I was the one holding the trigger. 200 miles away, entirely oblivious to the digital guillotine suspended above their heads, my family was retreating back into the city. The humiliating eviction from the Michigan property had severely fractured the grand illusion, leaving a tense, suffocating atmosphere in its wake. Donovan was demanding answers, his bluster masking a rising primal panic. Brenda was likely vibrating with anxiety, terrified of losing her country club status. But the most dangerous variable in their toxic ecosystem was Ashley. She was furious, embarrassed, and demanding to be placated. Devon, operating on the pure survival instinct of a cornered parasite, knew he had to immediately re-establish dominance. He needed to prove the lake house incident was merely a clerical error, a bizarre anomaly engineered by an estranged, jealous sister. He had to throw money at the problem. He chose Laura, a fiercely exclusive 3-Michelin-star fortress of culinary pretension, located in the absolute center of the city's wealthiest district. Securing a table on a Saturday evening required either months of foresight or the kind of aggressive cash-fueled bribery Devon specialized in. I knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. My monitoring scripts were still actively tracking the digital heartbeat of his compromised financial network. I watched the initial temporary pre-authorization hit one of the fraudulent platinum accounts securing their velvet booth. The restaurant was a cathedral of hushed voices, crystal chandeliers, and aggressively attentive service. This was Devon's preferred stage. He needed the validation of the maitre d' bowing to him, the sommelier offering deferential nods, and the envious glances of lesser patrons. He sat at the center of the table, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth, while Ashley sat beside him, adorned in the very diamonds purchased with my forged signature. Donovan and Brenda were there as well, eagerly absorbing the luxury, desperate to let the ambiance soothe their frayed nerves. Devon ordered with reckless theatrical abandon. The digital ledger on my screen updated with terrifying velocity as the evening progressed. Osetra caviar service, white truffles shaved tableside, 2 bottles of a spectacularly rare, astronomical vintage Bordeaux. It was a grotesque display of gluttony, a feast funded entirely by stolen equity and fabricated credit. But while they savored their imported wagyu and toasted to their imaginary success, the federal algorithms I had triggered were quietly executing their automated directives. When the investigative divisions of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service receive a comprehensively documented fraud package complete with IP logs, transaction hashes, and proof of ongoing active wire fraud, their response is not sluggish. The asset seizure protocols engage with ruthless, terrifying speed. Deep within the mainframe architecture of the global banking network, heavy digital doors were slamming shut. Accounts were frozen. Revolving credit lines were instantly revoked. The primary holding company Devon used to launder the syndicate money was flagged for immediate suspension. As the final plates were cleared away and the delicate spun sugar desserts were consumed, the waiter approached their table carrying a sleek black leather folio containing the astronomical bill. Devon did not even look at the total. He simply reached into his tailored suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flourish and extracted his heavy metal black card. He dropped it onto the leather with a soft, audible clink, a final performance of limitless liquidity, and waved the waiter away. I watched the transaction attempt register on my monitoring terminal. It was a massive 5-figure sum. The progress bar flashed green for a fraction of a second as it communicated with the clearinghouse. Then the screen went violently red. Error code 05, do not honor, account frozen. In the restaurant, the maestro of the dining room, the general manager himself, approached their velvet booth. His posture was no longer deferential. It was stiff, professional, and radiating a subtle, unmistakable tension. He leaned down, speaking in a hushed, discreet tone, designed to minimize the spectacle. He informed Devon that the primary card had been unfortunately declined. Devon scoffed loudly, an expertly feigned performance of irritation. He rolled his eyes at Ashley, muttering something about overzealous fraud protection algorithms triggering on large, out-of-pattern purchases. It was a practiced excuse, one he had likely used dozens of times to explain away declining balances. He reached into his designer wallet and confidently produced a second card, a premium corporate platinum tied to his Phantom Tech startup. The manager took the plastic, his expression tightening, and retreated to the point-of-sale terminal. On my screen, the second transaction attempt hit the network. Red, error code 05, account frozen. When the manager returned for the second time, the hushed discretion vanished. The temperature at the table plummeted. The manager informed Devon, his voice carrying just enough to turn the heads of the wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables, that the second payment method was also unusable. Ashley's pristine, manufactured smile faltered, replaced by a rigid mask of sudden, paralyzing terror. Donovan's face drained of color, the bluster instantly evaporating. Devon's hands began to shake. The effortless charisma shattered. He pulled out his wallet and dumped its contents onto the pristine white tablecloth. He handed the manager a third card, a standard high-yield rewards card. On my screen, red, declined. He grabbed a fourth card, a personal line of credit backed by the fraudulent secondary mortgage. Red, declined. The whispers from the surrounding tables grew louder, morphing into a distinct, audible hum of judgment. The elite patrons of Laura were witnessing the absolute destruction of a social climber. The manager did not leave the table again. He signaled for two large, impeccably dressed security personnel who materialized from the foyer with silent efficiency. With icy, uncompromising politeness, the manager instructed Devon that he could no longer process any payment attempts at the table. He requested that the entire party stand up and immediately follow him to the private administrative office to resolve the severe discrepancy, or he would be forced to involve the municipal police for theft of services. There was no negotiation. There was no charming their way out of the velvet booth. The facade was dead. Devon, Ashley, Donovan, and Brenda were forced to stand up in the middle of the crowded, silent dining room. Every eye in the restaurant was locked onto them, witnessing their profound, undeniable humiliation. They were marched out of the main dining area past the staring waitstaff, and the judging elite escorted like common criminals who had tried to dine and dash. They were paraded through the foyer and pushed out into the cold, unforgiving reality of the city streets, stripped of their stolen wealth and exposed to the world. The digital guillotine had dropped, and their house of cards had finally spectacularly collapsed. The humiliation on this pavement outside the restaurant did not humble my father. It merely ignited a blind, irrational rage. Donovan spent the entire night pacing the floor of his city townhouse, consuming the remnants of his liquor cabinet and convincing himself that the catastrophic card declines were a malicious, coordinated attack orchestrated entirely by me. In his warped reality, I had somehow hacked Devon's accounts as a petty act of vengeance following the cabin eviction. By dawn, his panic had completely transmuted into a vicious thirst for retaliation. He was going to hire the most ruthless, aggressive litigation firm in the state, bury me in frivolous lawsuits, and force me to surrender both the lake house and control of my own financial autonomy. He dressed in his sharpest charcoal suit, armored himself in his usual bluster, and marched into the polished marble lobby of his private wealth management bank exactly at opening. For 2 decades, this institution had catered to his every whim. The tellers usually greeted him by name, and the branch vice president routinely offered him espresso in bone china cups. Donovan bypassed the velvet ropes and the standard queue, striding directly toward the executive suites. He intended to withdraw a massive cashier's check, a 6-figure retainer, to secure a legal bulldog who would legally annihilate his own daughter. He slammed his palm against the reception desk, demanding immediate access to his primary wealth manager, an older man named Harrison. The young receptionist did not offer her usual bright smile. Instead, her eyes widened in alarm, her fingers hovering nervously over her keyboard. She asked him to wait a moment and hurried down the corridor. Donovan checked his gold watch, tapping his leather loafer against the marble floor, completely oblivious to the silent alarms ringing throughout the building's digital infrastructure. Harrison appeared moments later, but his demeanor was entirely wrong. There was no outstretched hand, no warm greeting, and no offer of premium coffee. The manager looked pale, his posture rigid and deeply uncomfortable. Without a word, he grabbed Donovan by the elbow with surprising force and ushered him quickly past the glass-walled offices into a windowless, soundproof conference room at the very back of the building. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, sealing them in a sterile silence. Donovan immediately unleashed his tirade. He demanded liquid cash. He ranted about banking glitches in competent credit bureaus and his impending lawsuit against me. He threw his platinum debit card onto the conference table, commanding Harrison to bypass whatever temporary hold was placed on his secondary accounts and issue a certified bank draft. If the bank could not resolve this minor inconvenience, he threatened loudly he would pull every single asset his family possessed and transfer his entire commercial portfolio to a rival institution before noon. Harrison did not flinch at the threat. He simply stared at my father with a mixture of professional detachment and profound pity. He did not reach for the platinum card resting on the table. Instead, he folded his hands and delivered the fatal blow. He informed Donovan in a flat, clinical tone that the bank could not process a withdrawal issue, a draft, or facilitate a transfer. They could not even cash a physical check. Donovan demanded to know why, his voice vibrating with unchecked fury. Harrison took a slow breath and explained that the bank no longer had any authority over the funds. At precisely 4 a.m, the institution's compliance division had received a sweeping mandatory execution order directly from the federal government. Every single financial instrument attached to Donovan's name, social security number, and corporate tax identification entities had been frozen by federal mandate. The freeze was absolute and uncompromising. It included his primary checking accounts, his emergency savings, the joint accounts he shared with Brenda, and the operational lines of credit for his commercial real estate firm. Furthermore, Harrison explained the mandate extended across the entire banking network. The accounts tied to Ashley, the shell corporations registered to Devon, and every interlocking trust they had utilized over the past year were completely locked down. Donovan's arrogant posture shattered. He slumped back into the leather chair, the color draining from his face as he weakly demanded an explanation. Harrison stated plainly that the bank was legally prohibited from discussing the granular details, but the warrants served by the authorities were explicitly clear. The family was currently under active joint investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The charges listed on the freeze mandates included coordinated wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and aggravated identity theft. The manager stood up, signaling the end of the meeting and the end of Donovan's status as a valued client. The institution viewed him strictly as a massive legal liability. Harrison advised my father to leave the premises immediately and seek criminal defense counsel, though he quietly noted the bitter irony that Donovan now possessed absolutely zero capital to pay for one. Donovan was escorted out of the executive suite not as a titan of industry, but as a neutralized threat. He stepped back out into the bustling city street, the morning sun offering no warmth. His custom-tailored suit felt heavy, a hollow costume masking his sudden total ruin. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against a useless leather wallet. He could not hire an aggressive litigator to destroy me. He could not secure a loan to fix the damage. He could not even buy a cup of coffee to steady his shaking hands. The impenetrable fortress of his wealth had been an illusion, and the federal government had just seized the rubble. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my home office, watching the digital ripples of the morning's absolute destruction settle across my monitors. The federal freeze had cascaded through the banking sector exactly as the algorithms dictated. The silence in my house was profound, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was engulfing my family 300 miles away. Then the sharp vibration of my personal cell phone shattered the stillness. The screen displayed a generic out-of-state area code. I had initiated strict carrier-level blocks on every number associated with Donovan, Brenda, Ashley, and Devin. This was an unregistered number, a prepaid burner phone. I pressed the accept button and lifted the device to my ear. The voice on the other end was entirely unrecognizable. It was high-pitched, breathy, and punctuated by ragged, hyperventilating sobs. For a fraction of a second, I thought it was a stranger reporting a car accident. Then the frantic, weeping voice choked out my name. It was Brenda. My mother had walked into a convenience store, purchased an untraceable plastic handset with whatever stray cash she could scavenge from her purse, and dialed my number in a state of absolute, unvarnished terror. The country club polished the practiced suburban superiority. The haughty disdain she had worn like armor for 30 years had completely evaporated. She was groveling. She launched into a chaotic, breathless monologue, her words stumbling over one another in a desperate bid to rewrite the reality of the morning. She swore it was all a catastrophic misunderstanding. She claimed Donovan had merely intended to use my pristine financial profile as a temporary, invisible bridge to secure Devin's necessary capital. It was a clerical mix-up, she wept, insisting that the notary, Arthur Vance, had simply placed the signature lines on the wrong addendum. She painted a pathetic, entirely fabricated picture of a family merely trying to help each other out during a brief liquidity crunch, promising they had fully intended to pay off the syndicate loan within the month before I ever found out. I listened to the frantic performance without saying a single word. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. You do not accidentally forge a social security number onto a multi-million-dollar mezzanine debt contract. You do not mistakenly drain a person's credit capacity across a dozen distinct luxury retail accounts. Brenda was not weeping out of remorse for the felony she had committed against her youngest daughter. She was sobbing because the federal government had just seized the keys to her kingdom. She was mourning the sudden violent death of her social status. When the initial wave of nonsensical excuses failed to elicit a response from me, Brenda shifted tactics. She abandoned the clerical error defense and reached for the heaviest, most toxic emotional weapon in her arsenal. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial, trembling whisper. She told me that Ashley was pregnant. The timing of this miraculous, undocumented conception was impossibly convenient. Brenda weaponized this hypothetical unborn child, instantly transforming it into a human shield to protect Devon from the consequences of his own predatory fraud. She wept loudly into the burner phone, demanding to know how I could be so deeply cruel as to send my future niece or nephew's father to a federal penitentiary. She painted Ashley as a fragile, innocent victim whose entire world was collapsing during the most vulnerable period of a woman's life. The implication was clear and venomous. If I did not reverse the damage, the stress would ruin Ashley's supposed pregnancy, and the blood would be entirely on my hands. The demand followed the guilt trip with jarring speed. Brenda begged me to call the authorities. She pleaded with me to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service and retract my comprehensive dossier. She wanted me to lie to federal agents. She wanted me to claim that the explosive, heavily documented fraud report was a mistake, a prank, or a domestic dispute blown wildly out of proportion. She demanded I formally state that I had authorized the signatures, effectively asking me to assume the crushing weight of their toxic debt and risk my own freedom to save Devon from the federal prosecutors. I let a long, heavy silence stretch across the cellular connection. When I finally spoke, my voice was devoid of any familial warmth. I informed her that the federal machinery does not operate like a customer service desk at a department store. You cannot simply call a toll-free number and cancel a multi-agency investigation into systemic wire fraud and tax evasion because you suddenly regret getting caught. The dossier I submitted contained hard, undeniable cryptographic proof of forgery, money laundering, and identity theft. The algorithms had already triggered the asset seizures. The prosecuting attorneys were already drafting the subpoenas. The avalanche had started, and there was no magical switch to turn it off. I addressed the sudden miraculous pregnancy. I told her that if Ashley was truly expecting a child, she should probably start researching state-funded health insurance and public assistance programs because her husband's black cards were currently sitting in an evidence locker. I reminded Brenda that they had willingly, consciously decided to throw me under a bus to fund a lifestyle built entirely on vapor. They had stolen my financial identity and forged my name, banking on my silence and my deeply ingrained habit of accepting their abuse. The weeping on the other end of the line stopped abruptly. The silence was absolute, heavy with the realization that the manipulation had completely failed. The groveling, the tears, the fabricated excuses, and the emotional blackmail had crashed against a solid wall of indifference. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked daughter desperate for a scrap of validation. I was the architect of their ruin. I did not wait for Brenda to conjure another lie or hurl another insult. I pressed the red button on my screen, severing the connection, and immediately added the burner number to my permanent block list. My phone instantly vibrated again. It was a second unregistered number. Brenda had clearly purchased multiple devices anticipating my resistance, armed with an arsenal of disposable plastic to continue her assault. I accepted the call, but I refused to let her utter a single syllable of her rehearsed victimhood. Before she could draw a breath to launch into another hysterical plea, I delivered my final, unwavering boundary with glacial, absolute clarity. Federal financial crimes are not family misunderstandings. You are begging for mercy from the daughter you banished to the basement. I did not wait for the inevitable gasp or the fresh wave of manufactured tears. I terminated the connection, permanently blocked the second number, and powered down my personal device entirely. My involvement in their desperate negotiations was concluded. Across the city, inside the sprawling, heavily mortgaged walls of my parents' suburban estate, the atmosphere had deteriorated into a pressure cooker of toxic panic. The grand living room, usually a pristine museum dedicated to Brenda's curated aesthetic, was utterly unrecognizable. It had become a war room of absolute failure. Stacks of useless financial documents, printed notices of frozen assets, and discarded, deactivated platinum cards cluttered the imported mahogany coffee table. The air was thick with the sour stench of stale scotch and overwhelming fear. Brenda sat frozen on the velvet sofa, staring blankly at the dead burner phone in her trembling hands. The dial tone echoed in the silent room like a death knell, signaling the terrifying reality that her favorite weapon, emotional manipulation, was entirely useless against me. The realization that I was not going to save them acted as a violent catalyst, igniting the volatile resentment that had been simmering between Devon and Ashley. The polished aristocratic facade of their marriage instantly vaporized, leaving behind two cornered parasites fighting over a rapidly shrinking host. Ashley was the first to strike, her manufactured poise shattered, replaced by a vicious, shrill fury. She hurled a heavy crystal tumbler across the room, watching it shatter against the marble fireplace, and turned her absolute rage onto her husband. She screamed that she had been lied to, completely deceived by his fabricated wealth and his imaginary tech empire. She demanded to know how he could be so profoundly incompetent as to leave a digital trail leading straight back to their luxury penthouse, exposing them both to federal prosecutors. She shrieked about the impending loss of her country club status, the absolute humiliation of being escorted out of a Michelin star restaurant by security, and the terrifying impending reality of prison uniforms replacing her silk blouses. Devon, stripped of his bespoke suits and his limitless credit, did not retreat. He matched her venom with a brutal, unhinged counterattack. His voice, usually smooth and calculated, became a jagged sneer. He blamed her insatiable, bottomless greed for their exposure. He screamed about the exorbitant designer wardrobes, the relentless demand for exotic car leases, and the ridiculous astronomical restaurant bills that had drained the stolen capital faster than he could effectively launder it. He viciously mocked her sudden, highly convenient pregnancy claim, calling it a pathetic, transparent manipulation tactic that had failed spectacularly to sway me. He told her she was a black hole for stolen funds, a walking liability whose sheer vanity had blinded her to the immense legal risks he was taking just to keep her draped in diamonds. They tore into each other with surgical precision, ripping away the shallow, transactional affection to reveal the absolute rot at the core of their partnership. The explosive screaming match rapidly consumed all the oxygen in the room, but the sheer velocity of their panic required a larger target. Devon and Ashley, desperate for a scapegoat to bear the weight of their impending federal indictments, pivoted simultaneously. They turned their unified, unhinged hostility directly onto my father. Donovan was slumped in his leather armchair, a shadow of the domineering patriarch who had commanded the family for decades. He looked small, defeated, and entirely powerless, nursing an empty glass, as his golden child and his prized son-in-law descended upon him like starved predators. Devon led the assault, his face flushed with manic rage. He viciously blamed Donovan for the catastrophic failure at the lake house. He screamed that Donovan's inability to control his temper, his pathetic need to assert dominance over a simple eviction notice, had ruined months of meticulous planning. If Donovan had just swallowed his pride, if he had just played the role of the loving father and successfully manipulated me into signing the documents, they would have secured the massive commercial equity line. That single signature was the only thing standing between them and a federal penitentiary, and Donovan had let it walk out the door. He accused my father of being a clumsy, outdated dinosaur who lacked the finesse required to execute a high-level financial maneuver. Ashley joined the verbal execution, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She berated him for failing to manage his own daughter. She accused him of being a weak, ineffective patriarch who could not even extract a simple signature from the family's designated subordinate. She screamed that his arrogance and his spectacular failure to secure the capital had doomed them all, dragging her down into the mud with his incompetence. They relentlessly hammered him, utilizing the exact same dismissive, degrading language Donovan had used against me for my entire life. Donovan did not roar back. He did not issue threats, demand respect, or pound his fists on the table. Stripped of his bank accounts, his authority, and his illusion of ultimate control, he simply sat in the ruins of his living room, absorbing the vicious, unyielding blame. The money had always been the source of his power, and without it, he was nothing to them. He stared at the floor, trapped in his own home, listening as his fraudulent dynasty tore itself apart. But Donovan was a man who had spent his entire existence treating defeat as a temporary, unacceptable inconvenience. When the federal freeze choked off his digital liquidity, his survival instinct aggressively pivoted toward the physical domain. The sprawling suburban estate was still packed with tangible wealth items accumulated during decades of unchecked debt fueled consumption. Ignoring the vicious screaming match still raging between Devon and Ashley down the hall, my father retreated to the master suite. He bypassed the stack of frozen bank statements and went directly for the hidden wall safe concealed behind a heavy gilded mirror. Inside rested Brenda's meticulously curated collection of fine jewelry. These were not the cheap, flashy baubles Devon favored, but solid, heavy pieces of inherited gold platinum tennis bracelets and high-clarity diamond colliers. Without a shred of hesitation, and without a single word of consultation with his wife, Donovan swept the entire velvet-lined tray into a canvas duffel bag. He sneaked out the back door, driving his remaining unseized vehicle to a discreet, high-end pawnbroker located far outside his usual social circles. He liquidated decades of Brenda's prized personal possessions for a fraction of their appraised value, walking out with thick banded stacks of untraceable currency. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately, because top-tier law firms do not accept retainers from federally frozen accounts. He could not afford a polished corporate litigator to untangle the mess. Instead, he sought out a notorious aggressive defense attorney named Vance Sterling, a man who operated out of a strip mall office and specialized in legal intimidation, dirty tactics, and clients desperate enough to pay in $100 bills. Sterling was a legal mercenary, a bottom feeder who thrived on manufacturing chaos and extracting settlements through sheer belligerence. Donovan dumped the cash onto Sterling's scuffed laminate desk, purchasing a localized campaign of terror. The strategy was not to beat the federal indictment that was impossible, given the digital footprint I had secured, but to shake me down for enough unmonitored capital to flee the jurisdiction. 2 days later, a courier arrived at my secure corporate office, slapping a thick manila envelope onto my receptionist's desk. The paperwork inside was a masterpiece of desperate, fabricated legal aggression. Sterling had filed a preliminary injunction and a demand for a mandatory emergency mediation session. The attached notice threatened me with a massive civil lawsuit for defamation of character, tortious interference with business relations, and the theft of familial assets. The sheer audacity of the claims was staggering. Donovan was legally arguing that my federal whistleblower reports were entirely malicious fabrications designed to ruin his reputation, and that my refusal to sign the fraudulent loan documents constituted a targeted theft of the family's rightful financial trajectory. It was a completely frivolous, legally toothless threat designed to trigger panic and force a rapid, quiet settlement. They assumed I would be terrified of a public court battle, terrified of the family name being dragged through the mud, and willing to pay a massive sum of hush money to make the aggressive lawyer go away. They fundamentally misunderstood the new reality. I did not experience a single flutter of anxiety as I read through Sterling's amateurish threats. There was no panic, no urge to capitulate, and absolutely no fear. The federal investigations were already self-sustaining entities, churning through subpoenaed bank records and extracting IP logs across multiple states. A civil defamation suit filed by a man under active IRS investigation was practically comedic. I could have simply ignored the summons, passed it to a corporate litigator, and let the courts throw it out with prejudice. But ignoring them felt insufficient. Donovan, Brenda, Ashley, and Devon needed to understand that the dynamic had permanently shifted. They needed to see that their intimidation tactics, the very foundation of their power over me, for my entire life, were completely neutralized. I drafted a concise one-sentence email to Vance Sterling's office, formally agreeing to attend the emergency mediation session. I did not hire a defense attorney to accompany me. I did not prepare a countersuit or a list of demands. I simply packed a single slim black leather briefcase. Inside, I placed a printed bound copy of the exact dossier I had already surrendered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, complete with the forensic data tracing their wire fraud, and a certified letter from the IRS confirming the active status of their tax evasion inquiry. The mediation was scheduled at a neutral rented conference facility on the edge of the city's industrial district. It was a sterile, lifeless building with flickering fluorescent lights, water-stained ceiling tiles, and cheap commercial carpeting. It was a stark, intentional visual downgrade from the mahogany boardrooms and luxury restaurants my family previously occupied, reflecting the reality of Sterling's low-rent operation. I arrived precisely on time, my heels clicking against the linoleum floor with measured, unhurried purpose. I bypassed the indifferent receptionist and walked directly into the designated meeting room. The contrast was jarring. My family was huddled around a cheap faux wood folding table radiating exhaustion and unchecked panic. Donovan's suit looked slept in his collar, undone, his face haggard and lined with deep stress. Brenda sat beside him, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, staring blankly at the bare walls, having undoubtedly discovered her empty wall safe that morning. Devin and Ashley sat at the far end, physically distanced from each other, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, projecting a fragile, shattered hostility. Vance Sterling stood at the head of the table, attempting to project an aura of menacing legal authority, his cheap cologne masking the scent of stale coffee and desperation. I stepped into the room holding my single black briefcase and took the lone chair on the opposite side of the table. I did not greet them. I did not offer a polite smile or a flicker of familial recognition. I sat down, placed the briefcase squarely in front of me on the cheap laminate surface, and waited in absolute unbroken silence for their final pathetic performance to begin. Vance Sterling cleared his throat, the sound sharp and abrasive in the sterile, airless room. He adjusted the lapels of his ill-fitting suit and launched into his opening statement with the aggressive theatrical cadence of a man who watched too many courtroom television dramas. He paced the short length of the cheap commercial carpet, attempting to command the space, seemingly oblivious to the flickering fluorescent lights buzzing above us. As Sterling began to speak, Donovan visibly shifted in his rigid folding chair. He pulled his shoulders back, thrusting his chest forward in a desperate, transparent attempt to summon the ghosts of his former dominance. He set his jaw and narrowed his eyes, trying to project his old, terrifying arrogance. He wanted to look like a titan of industry presiding over a hostile corporate acquisition rather than a ruined, desperate man fighting for his survival in a rented industrial suite. He smoothed the fabric of his rumpled charcoal suit, clinging to the physical remnants of his wealth, while his lawyer went on the offensive. Sterling wove a fantastical, entirely unhinged narrative. He did not address me as a victim of massive coordinated identity theft. Instead, he painted a vivid picture of a rogue, spiteful daughter who had completely lost her grip on reality. His voice dripped with practiced condescension as he accused me of orchestrating a relentless campaign of psychological and financial terror against my own blood. He claimed that my lifelong jealousy over my sister's beauty and charm had festered into a malicious obsession. According to his twisted timeline, the eviction at the Michigan cabin was not a lawful reclamation of my stolen property, but a calculated illegal hijacking of a beloved family sanctuary. He framed my actions as a traumatic, unprovoked assault on my elderly parents and my vulnerable, newly pregnant sister, carried out purely to satisfy my vindictive ego. Brenda nodded along with Sterling's words, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, perfectly playing the role of the deeply wounded matriarch. Ashley sat beside her, her arms crossed defensively, attempting to project the image of a fragile victim rather than a willing accomplice to federal wire fraud. But Sterling reserved his most passionate defense for Devin. He turned and gestured expansively toward the sweating, cornered con artist at the end of the table. He did not describe Devin as a parasitic grifter who had drained my father's accounts and forged my signature on toxic debt contracts. Instead, Sterling proclaimed him to be a visionary, a brilliant tech CEO whose groundbreaking startup was on the absolute cusp of revolutionizing the software industry. Sterling insisted that my comprehensive dossiers to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service were nothing more than hysterical, fabricated lies. He categorized the IP logs, the forged DocuSign metadata, and the mapped financial routing numbers as a web of digital sabotage deliberately engineered to ruin an innocent innovator out of petty, spiteful sibling rivalry. The sheer audacity of the presentation was staggering. They had constructed an alternate universe, a reality where their catastrophic financial crimes were simply erased, replaced by a narrative where they were the innocent targets of a jealous, unhinged spinster. Devin actually sat up straighter as his lawyer praised his imaginary genius, his ego briefly inflated by the manufactured validation, even as federal agents were likely dismantling his shell corporations. With the stage set and the fictional victimhood firmly established, Sterling reached the climax of his extortion pitch. He reached into his briefcase and slapped a thick, legally binding document onto the center of the laminate table. It was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement packed with draconian gag orders and severe financial penalties for any future disparagement of the family name or Devin's business practices. Next to the NDA, Sterling placed a formal demand letter. The terms were explicit. They demanded a certified, irreversible wire transfer in the exact amount of $1.8 million. It was not a random punitive number drawn from thin air. It was a highly specific calculated sum. It was the exact amount of liquidity required to cover the gaping, immediate hole in Devin's private lending syndicate, appease their aggressive underground creditors, unfreeze a fraction of their legitimate assets, and buy them just enough breathing room to flee the jurisdiction or restructure their fraudulent enterprise. Sterling stepped back, crossing his arms with a smug, satisfied smirk, believing he had successfully cornered me. The room fell silent, the heavy air thick with anticipation. This was Donovan's cue. The patriarch leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, locking his cold, demanding eyes onto mine. He spoke for the first time since I had entered the room, his voice attempting its old, rumbling, unquestionable authority. He told me that he was willing to be reasonable. He stated that if I signed the NDA, immediately officially retracted my federal complaints, and wired the $1.8 million by the close of business, he would call off his legal dogs. He would graciously drop his frivolous defamation lawsuit. He would halt his pursuit of my personal assets. But the final condition was the most profound display of his absolute delusion. Donovan offered me a trade. In exchange for the $1.8 million and my total silence, he would grant me his forgiveness. He spoke the word as if it were a priceless gemstone, a holy relic that I should be weeping with gratitude to receive. He promised that if I paid their ransom, he would overlook my temporary insanity, forgive my aggressive disrespect, and allow me to return to the family fold. He genuinely believed that the threat of his permanent disapproval, the risk of being formally excommunicated from his toxic bloodline, was still a weapon that held ultimate power over my actions. He sat back in his chair, a confident smirk playing on his lips, waiting for me to surrender. I did not break eye contact with my father. I did not blink, sigh, or offer a single syllable of argument to counter Vance Sterling's fabricated fairy tale. The oppressive silence in the rented conference room stretched heavy and suffocating as my family waited for the lifetime of conditioning to kick in. They expected the quiet, obedient daughter to panic under the harsh fluorescent lights, to reach for a pen with trembling hands to beg for the crumbs of Donovan's toxic forgiveness. They expected me to fold under the immense pressure of their unified front. Instead, I reached for the polished brass clasps of my single black leather briefcase. The sharp metallic snaps echoed like gunshots in the sterile space, cutting through the thick air of their delusion. I lifted the lid, revealing not a checkbook or a signed non-disclosure agreement, but a stack of meticulously organized, undeniable reality. I withdrew the first thick wire-bound portfolio and placed it onto the cheap laminate table. I slid it across the smooth surface, stopping precisely in front of Vance Sterling. I watched the sleazy attorney look down at the cover page. It was the comprehensive 5-year financial trail documenting my systematic acquisition of their distressed liabilities. I did not need to speak for the numbers to paralyze him. The ledger mapped out exactly how I had utilized my untraceable independent capital to purchase the toxic defaulted debt Donovan had been secretly accumulating for half a decade. The document proved with absolute legal certainty that I did not just stumble upon their financial ruin. I owned it. I was the primary creditor holding the notes on their underwater mortgages, their leveraged equity lines, and the very foundation of their fraudulent lifestyle. Sterling's smirk wavered, replaced by a sudden, sharp flicker of confusion as his eyes darted across the irrefutable bank stamps and transfer records. Before the lawyer could process the sheer magnitude of the financial trap closing around his clients, I withdrew the second file. I pushed it across the table, letting it come to rest perfectly aligned next to the first. This was a certified, independently audited cybersecurity report. I watched Sterling flip open the cover. Inside was the undeniable digital fingerprint of their felony. The forensic data mapped the exact specific Internet Protocol address registered to Donovan's suburban estate directly to the forged mezzanine loan applications that utilized my stolen Social Security number. It bypassed Devon's amateurish attempts at routing through proxy servers. It obliterated their entire narrative of me acting as a rogue, spiteful hacker attempting to ruin a brilliant tech visionary. The data proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the systemic identity theft and multi-million-dollar fraud had been executed from the comfort of my parents' own living room. The blood began to rapidly drain from Sterling's face. The aggressive theatrical bluster he had projected just moments ago completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning, terrifying realization of what he was actually looking at. I reached into my briefcase one final time. I pulled out a single, heavily embossed sheet of federal cardstock. I slid it across the table, completing the triad of their absolute destruction. It was a watermarked copy of an active, unsealed subpoena issued directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically targeting Devon's fraudulent shell company. It detailed the immediate seizure of all related corporate assets, communication logs, and internal ledgers, citing an ongoing multi-agency probe into systemic wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Vance Sterling stared at the three documents arrayed before him. His hands began to physically shake. He was a bottom feeder, a legal mercenary who thrived on empty threats, intimidation, and shaking down frightened targets for quick cash settlements. He specialized in local civil disputes and noisy defamation claims. He did not specialize in defending active targets of a coordinated federal criminal takedown. He recognized instantly that the papers sitting on the table were not negotiating tactics or leverage for a family dispute. They were a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. Sterling did not consult his clients. He did not look at Donovan, Brenda, Devon, or Ashley. He shoved his chair back with such violent force that the metal legs shrieked against the commercial carpeting. He scrambled to his feet, his breathing shallow and rapid. He snatched his own cheap legal pad from the table, hastily shoving it into his scuffed briefcase. The illusion of his menacing legal authority had been entirely shattered by the crushing weight of federal jurisdiction. "I am withdrawing as counsel," Sterling announced, his voice a panicked, breathless croak. He snapped his briefcase shut, backing away from the table as if the documents I had provided were radioactive. "Effective immediately. This meeting is over. I was retained for a civil defamation suit. I was not informed of an active federal criminal investigation, nor was I informed of documented, undeniable wire fraud." Donovan opened his mouth, his face purple with sudden, uncomprehending rage. He demanded his lawyer sit back down, barking orders as if he still commanded a corporate boardroom. He bellowed about the retainer he had paid in cash, commanding Sterling to do the job he had been hired for and shut down this insubordinate display. Sterling did not stop moving toward the exit. He paused with his hand on the brass doorknob, turning back to look at my father with absolute, unvarnished disgust. "Keep the retainer," Sterling shot back, his voice vibrating with pure fear. "I am not going down as a co-conspirator in a federal indictment. You lied to me about the scope of this dispute, and you are holding radioactive forged documents. You are completely on your own." Sterling threw open the door and bolted down the sterile hallway, not looking back. The heavy door swung shut on its pneumatic hinge, the latch clicking into place with a definitive ringing finality. The vacuum left behind in the rented conference room was absolute. The aggressive bluster, the fabricated defamation threats, and the hollow demands for hush money had vanished along with the sleazy attorney. I sat in the oppressive, ringing silence, watching the realization wash over the four people across the table. Donovan's smug, arrogant smirk had been wiped away entirely. He looked from the closed door to the three devastating files resting on the laminate surface, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His grand bluff had been entirely dismantled, his hired gun had fled in absolute terror, and the protective walls of his delusion had been smashed to pieces. He was stripped of his armor, completely defenseless, and entirely exposed to the unyielding machinery of the justice system. I did not linger to watch the remaining oxygen leave the room. I stood up, retrieved my briefcase, and walked out into the damp, industrial afternoon air. The machinery of the federal justice system had been fully engaged, and it required absolutely no further assistance from me. I returned to my life, severing the final frayed threads that connected me to my toxic bloodline. I let the calendar turn, knowing perfectly well that the federal bureaucracy moved with an agonizing, meticulous, and completely unstoppable precision. Exactly 90 days later, the hammer finally fell. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when a fleet of unmarked dark SUVs descended upon the sleek glass-fronted downtown high-rise that housed Devon's supposed tech empire. The leased office space was a sprawling monument to his vaporous wealth, featuring polished concrete floors, custom neon signage, and rows of expensive, untouched ergonomic workstations designed solely to fool passing investors and easily manipulated venture capitalists. It was the perfect, highly staged theatrical set for his final humiliating public performance. Federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests emblazoned with yellow FBI lettering bypassed the stunned, highly paid receptionist and flooded the open-plan floor. They moved with coordinated, overwhelming force, carrying stacks of flattened cardboard evidence boxes and executing a sealed, no-knock warrant. Devon was sitting in his corner office, likely drafting another fabricated prospectus or attempting to stall another aggressive creditor when the glass door was breached. There was no time to deploy his usual smooth-talking charm or engage in slick negotiations. The agent systematically disconnected his servers, seized his encrypted hard drives, and physically removed him from his imported leather executive chair. Witnesses from neighboring corporate suites later described the chaotic scene as Devon was marched through the crowded, sunlit marble lobby of the financial district building. His bespoke, tailored Italian suit was severely rumpled, his face was drained of all blood and color, and his wrists were secured tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. He was officially under federal arrest, indicted on multiple compounding counts of systemic wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The polished, untouchable entrepreneur was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken criminal being escorted directly into the back of a federal transport vehicle. The grand illusion of his unrivaled brilliance had been completely dismantled, reduced to raw digital evidence and cryptographic logs sitting in a federal prosecutor's filing cabinet. While Devon was being photographed, fingerprinted, and processed through the federal booking system without the option for immediate bail, the collateral damage of his absolute ruin was simultaneously detonating across the affluent suburbs. Ashley had desperately clung to the superficial trappings of her manufactured status, completely ignoring the avalanche of frozen accounts, ignored subpoenas, and mounting legal threats. She was stubbornly determined to project an image of unfazed generational wealth, attempting to maintain her daily routines as if the walls of her curated reality were not violently collapsing around her. Her profound denial was violently shattered in the middle of her pristine, manicured cul-de-sac. It was early afternoon, precisely the time when the exclusive neighborhood was most active, with returning joggers, professional landscaping crews, and affluent housewives walking pedigreed dogs. Ashley was returning from a failed, desperate attempt to use a depleted maximum limit credit card at a local luxury boutique. She parked her pristine, custom-ordered white Porsche Cayenne in the wide, circular driveway of the massive house they were actively being evicted from. Before she could even unlatch her seatbelt or gather her empty shopping bags, A heavy-duty flatbed tow truck blocked her path, its amber lights flashing aggressively against the suburban landscape. Two men wearing high-visibility vests stepped out of the cab holding a thick stack of recovery orders and a set of heavy steel chains. Ashley stepped out of the vehicle, her voice instantly escalating into a shrill, panicked shriek that echoed off the neighboring brick facades. She demanded they move the truck immediately, threatening them with non-existent highly paid lawyers and screaming about unlawful trespassing. The recovery agents were entirely unfazed by her hysterical, dramatic display. They calmly and professionally presented the judicial repossession order, validating that the luxury vehicle had not seen a single legitimate loan payment in over 7 months. As the hydraulic winch whined loudly and the massive flatbed tilted down, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn out by the escalating commotion. Ashley stood frozen on the black asphalt, her oversized designer sunglasses completely failing to hide her absolute, undeniable public humiliation. She watched helplessly as the physical manifestation of her perceived superiority was unceremoniously chained by the axles and hoisted onto the truck. The neighbors she had spent years looking down upon, the women she had alienated with her relentless arrogance, were now openly watching her ruin, whispering behind manicured hedges and peering through the slats of their plantation shutters. But the public repossession was merely the surface of her immediate nightmare. As the tow truck rumbled out of the neighborhood, leaving her entirely stranded in the street, the true depth of Devon's betrayal became undeniably, terrifyingly clear. The thick packet of final default notices the recovery agents had handed her laid bare the catastrophic, unmanageable financial reality. Devon had not just funded his fraudulent tech company with my stolen identity. He had methodically and ruthlessly dumped the entirety of their personal unsecured debt directly onto his wife. He had taken out massive, high-interest personal loans using her pristine credit score, opened dozens of hidden retail accounts in her name, and leveraged her signature on the catastrophic auto lease that had just vanished down the street. Ashley stood completely alone on the pavement, clutching the stack of final notices, engulfed by the realization that she was entirely legally responsible for millions of dollars in fraudulent, unpayable debt. Devon had utilized her as a convenient disposable shield, ensuring that when the financial structure inevitably imploded, she would be the one buried beneath the rubble. Her unborn child, her fabricated victimhood, and her relentless greed had provided zero protection against her husband's predatory survival instincts. She was entirely bankrupt, completely isolated, and drowning in a sea of toxic liabilities with absolutely no rescue in sight. The blast radius of Devon's highly publicized arrest expanded outward with terrifying, unstoppable speed, obliterating the remaining illusions of safety my parents harbored. The forensic internet protocol data and the meticulously mapped digital routing numbers I had dropped onto Vance Sterling's table were not merely a bluff to force a retreat. They were a meticulously gift-wrapped treasure map for federal prosecutors. Within a matter of weeks, the Department of Justice formally extended their net. A federal grand jury presented with undeniable stamped evidence of systemic fraud handed down a devastating multi-count indictment against Donovan and Brenda. The charges were ironclad, carrying mandatory minimums that guaranteed decades behind bars: aggravated identity theft, conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, and complicity in a sprawling financial racketeering scheme. The very home where they had hosted their lavish holiday dinners, the estate where they had arrogantly plotted my complete financial ruin while drinking imported wine, had been officially designated in federal warrants as the physical staging ground for their corporate crimes. The government moved swiftly to freeze their remaining untainted assets, placing a massive, unmovable lien on the suburban estate they prized above all else. To avoid immediate pretrial detention in a federal holding facility, and to hire criminal defense attorneys willing to take a case burdened with such radioactive, irrefutable digital evidence, my parents required massive, instantaneous liquidity. The offshore bank accounts were frozen by the Treasury. The phantom equity in Devon's vaporous startup was gone. They had absolutely no choice but to initiate a total, deeply humiliating fire sale of their entire lives. The sprawling, pristine estate was listed well below market value, stripped of its prestige, and sold to an anonymous cash buyer in a matter of days. A fleet of aggressive, indifferent estate liquidators descended upon the property to clear out the contents. I did not attend the public auction, but the brutal details trickled back to me through the legal grapevine. The heavy mahogany dining table where my father had arrogantly demanded my total obedience, the imported crystal chandeliers that had illuminated my mother's manufactured brittle elegance, the Persian rugs, the curated art collection they barely understood. All of it was tagged with neon barcode stickers, haggled over by bargain hunters, and hauled away in generic rented moving trucks. They were financially eviscerated, reduced to liquidating the physical evidence of their curated existence just to keep themselves out of handcuffs while they awaited a brutal trial. With the proceeds immediately seized to cover mandatory restitution escrow and exorbitant non-refundable legal retainers, Donovan and Brenda were violently thrust into a reality they had spent their entire lives ruthlessly mocking. Stripped of their hoarded wealth, their manufactured social status, and their toxic, unquestionable authority, they were forced to sign a month-to-month lease on a cramped ground-floor unit in a decaying, deeply depressing apartment complex on the gray industrial edge of the city. The contrast was absolute and punishing. The grand, sweeping staircases and vaulted ceilings of their former estate were replaced by narrow, poorly lit hallways, smelling permanently of stale cooking grease and damp, rotting carpet. The thick, soundproof walls that had once insulated their vicious plotting were traded for paper-thin drywall that offered absolutely zero protection from the shouting matches of anonymous neighbors. Donovan, the man who had demanded total subservience from his family and projected the aura of an untouchable corporate titan, was reduced to a powerless, exhausted old man, forced to argue with apathetic landlords over leaking plumbing and rattling broken radiators. Brenda, who had spent decades weaponizing her social standing, judging her peers and hosting lavish catered galas, was now forced to navigate crowded communal laundry rooms, hiding her face behind dark sunglasses in utter shame from neighbors she would have previously deemed entirely invisible. The absolute loss of control, the inescapable grinding humiliation of their bleak new existence, was a claustrophobic prison entirely of their own making. As the seasons changed, and the terrifying reality of their impending criminal trials fully set in the arrogant silence I had enforced, was finally broken. It was not breached by fresh threats or legal demands, but by desperate, pathetic begging. I sat at the polished glass desk in my spacious, sunlit corner office, reviewing the latest quarterly projections for my rapidly expanding independent portfolio. My executive assistant knocked softly on the heavy oak door, stepping inside with the daily stack of sorted mail. She placed a small, distinct pile of envelopes on the edge of my desk, offering a sympathetic, knowing glance, before quietly excusing herself and pulling the door shut. I looked down at the mail. The return addresses printed in the corners all belonged to the bleak industrial apartment complex. There were nearly a dozen of them arriving in a steady, relentless stream over the past 3 weeks. The handwriting on the envelopes was instantly, painfully recognizable. Some bore the frantic, sloping cursive of my mother, the expensive stationery she had hoarded eventually giving way to cheap lined notebook paper. The ink was occasionally smeared by what I could only assume were performative, strategic drops of water meant to simulate tears. Others were addressed in the rigid block lettering of my father, the aggressive, heavy pen strokes completely belying the desperate, clawing panic that had undoubtedly fueled the correspondence. I knew exactly, without a shadow of a doubt, what was contained within the folded pages. There would be no genuine accountability, no true recognition of the psychological and financial violence they had inflicted upon me for decades. Instead, the heavy envelopes were packed with manipulative apologies, desperate pleas for legal leniency, and cowardly groveling requests for financial salvation. They were attempting to weaponize the very concept of family they had spent my entire life destroying, hoping beyond hope that my success and fundamental decency could somehow serve as a life raft for their rapidly sinking ship. They wanted me to intercede with the federal prosecutors. They wanted me to drop my civil claims. They wanted me to rescue them from the catastrophic consequences they had so arrogantly and methodically engineered. I stared at the stack of letters, searching myself for a flicker of pity, a tug of familiar obligation, or the desperate childhood need for their approval. There was nothing. Those vulnerabilities had been burned away, completely replaced by a cold, impenetrable armor of absolute self-reliance and undeniable truth. I gathered the thick stack of unopened envelopes in my right hand, feeling the substantial physical weight of their desperate, manufactured remorse. I stood from my desk and walked across the plush carpet toward the far corner of the room. Resting silently against the wall was a heavy-duty industrial-grade paper shredder, a massive machine designed for the permanent, irreversible destruction of sensitive corporate documents. I reached out and flipped the heavy power switch. The machine hummed to life, immediately emitting a low mechanical growl of sharp interlocking steel blades waiting to be fed. I did not open a single envelope. I did not read a single word of their fabricated apologies or their cowardly pleas for salvation. I held the first thick envelope over the feed slot and simply let it drop. The machine grabbed the paper, instantly pulling it down into the dark, churning mechanism with a harsh, satisfying, guttural grind. I watched as the return address, the desperate handwriting, and the hollow promises were violently shredded into thousands of unrecognizable microscopic ribbons of cross-cut confetti. I fed the second letter into the slot, then the third, moving with a calm, steady, and entirely methodical rhythm. The heavy steel blades chewed through their manipulation, without hesitation, reducing their toxic legacy to a pile of meaningless, recycled waste. I continued until my hands were completely empty, standing alone in the quiet peace of my office, as the shredder whirred into a low hum. I turned off the machine, walked back to my desk, and went back to my life. That return to my life was not merely a shift in focus back to a spreadsheet. It was a definitive, permanent stride into a future entirely untethered from the chaotic gravity of my bloodline. The noise, the manipulation, and the endless cycles of manufactured crisis had finally been silenced, replaced by the steady, productive hum of my own uncompromised ambition. The calendar pages turned, the seasons shifted, and the relentless machinery of my vision took physical form. Today, that form is a breathtaking reality. I stand in the center of my corner office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a panoramic, unobstructed view of the gleaming downtown skyline. The evening sun casts a warm, golden glow across the polished oak of my desk and the sleek, modern lines of the conference area. The frosted glass door across the reception suite bears the name of my newly minted empire in crisp, bold lettering, Vanguard Financial Risk Consulting. This is not a rented airless suite or a temporary staging ground for a grift. It is a fortress of forensic accounting and corporate security, a premier firm dedicated to dismantling the exact type of predatory financial schemes my family had attempted to execute. This entire enterprise, from the state-of-the-art servers, humming silently in the climate-controlled data room, to the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suites, was fully funded by a pristine, legally ironclad injection of capital. The $1.8 million I had reclaimed from the lawful, unchallengeable sale of the Michigan cabin had not just been a victory over Donovan's theft, it was the seed money for my independence. I took the very asset they had hijacked to mask their fraud and transformed it into a weapon of absolute transparency. The irony is as satisfying as it is profound. The funds they desperately demanded to save themselves from federal prison were instead utilized to hire top-tier analysts, secure premium commercial real estate, and launch a consultancy that hunts predators just like them. The quiet focus of the workday has transitioned seamlessly into a vibrant, joyous celebration. Tonight is the official launch party for Vanguard, and my office has been transformed to match the occasion. A string quartet plays a lively, elegant arrangement in the corner of the expansive lounge area, their music drifting perfectly over the hum of genuine, relaxed conversation. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms circulate effortlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays adorned with delicate hors d'oeuvres and crystal flutes of vintage champagne. The air in the room is light, completely devoid of the suffocating tension, hidden agendas, and transactional greed that defined every gathering I had ever attended in my parents' sprawling suburban estate. I take a slow sip from my glass, letting my gaze drift across the people filling the room. This is a curated assembly of brilliant, decent human beings who have proven their worth through action rather than demanding blind loyalty through genetics. Near the custom-built marble bar, I see Marcus, the brilliant, unassuming cybersecurity forensic auditor who had meticulously mapped Donovan's internet protocol address and shattered Devon's digital alibi. He is laughing openly, sharing a story with Sarah, the senior financial partner, who mentored me during my grueling early years as a junior analyst. She had recognized my talent when my own parents were actively insisting I was a failure. Scattered throughout the room are my loyal colleagues, the dedicated team of investigators and risk managers I personally recruited to build this firm. There are old friends who stood by me during the darkest, most isolating moments of the federal fallout, people who never once asked for a loan, a favor, or a piece of my success. They are simply here to celebrate a victory they helped make possible. Watching them interact, sharing genuine warmth and mutual respect, the contrast between my past and my present becomes staggeringly clear. For 30 years, I was conditioned to believe that love was a currency to be withheld, that respect was something to be constantly earned but never granted, and that my sole purpose was to serve as a silent, compliant foundation for the towering egos of my father and sister. I was taught that the cramped, windowless basement of their ambition was the only place I belonged. I was expected to shoulder their burdens, absorb their debts, and remain endlessly grateful for the privilege of being ignored. But looking at the vibrant, successful reality I have engineered, surrounded by the towering glass and steel of the city I now conquer, I recognize the absolute fallacy of that conditioning. The people in this room did not arrive with open hands and manufactured grievances. They arrived with blueprints, encouragement, and unwavering support. They offered their expertise when I was building my defense, their loyalty when I was launching my counteroffensive, and their unvarnished joy now that the battle has been conclusively won. The music gently fades as Marcus catches my eye and raises his glass high into the air. The gesture ripples through the room. Conversations quiet, and the diverse crowd of brilliant, supportive faces turns toward me. They hold their champagne flutes up, a unified, silent tribute to the sheer magnitude of what we have built together. I raise my own glass in return, the crystal catching the last brilliant light of the setting sun. I do not need to deliver a long theatrical speech. The polished reality of this room speaks volumes more than any words I could offer. I smile, a genuine, completely unburdened expression of absolute peace, and take a drink. Family isn't the people who push you into the basement and demand you be grateful. Family are the people standing with you at the top, because they helped you build the foundation to get there. The most profound lesson from Hannah's journey is that loyalty should never mean enduring abuse. For years, she was conditioned to accept mistreatment and financial exploitation under the guise of familial duty. However, her ultimate triumph proves that bloodlines do not entitle anyone to your peace, sanity, or success. True family is not defined by shared genetics, but by mutual respect, unwavering support, and shared values. By severing her toxic ties, she created the space to build a genuine, uplifting support system. Share your own experience with setting healthy boundaries, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.